The first reports came from French medics in the spring of 1940. Prisoners arrived trembling, wide-eyed, and impossibly alert after days without sleep. Some spoke in frantic bursts. Others stared at nothing, their pupils fixed like they were still chasing the echo of engines. At first, doctors blamed shock. But the blood samples told another story, a stimulant powerful enough to push the human body far past its natural limits. Across the German lines, field commanders were witnessing something uncanny. Infantry units marching through the night without rest, tank crews fighting for 30 hours straight, officers describing soldiers with unnatural stamina, men who moved with a kind of wired certainty that bordered on reckless. Behind the precision of the Blitzkrieg lay a quieter, engine-white tablets, handed out like rations, approved by medical officers, and considered as vital as fuel. This was Pervitin methamphetamine, a drug that turned exhaustion into momentum and helped drive some of the fastest military advances in modern history. A pharmaceutical experiment became a battlefield advantage, woven into strategy, discipline, and the psychology of an entire army. So tonight, dim the lights and listen closely. Imagine standing in the cold dawn, watching thousands of soldiers move with energy no human should possess. Subscribe and stay with me. Tell me where you're watching from, and remember the cost of a war machine, fueled not only by ideology and steel, but by a drug that pushed men beyond the edge of humanity. The story begins not on a battlefield, but in a laboratory on a quiet Berlin street in the late 1930s. Germany was rebuilding itself with desperate speed, reshaping industry, research, and national purpose under a regime that demanded constant motion. Factories ran late into the night, ministries pushed quotas to exhaustion, and the military, still officially restricted by Versailles, searched for every possible advantage. In this atmosphere, the search for energy became almost as important as the search for weapons. At the Temmler Pharmaceutical Company, chemists worked long hours refining a stimulant first synthesized in Japan decades earlier. It was a crystalline compound with a clinical, chemical smell, simple, bitter, and unnervingly potent. When the Temmler team altered and purified it, they produced a substance that shocked even veteran researchers. Methamphetamine, a stimulant far stronger than anything legally available in Europe. It raised heart rate, sharpened focus, erased fatigue, and flooded the mind with a sense of confidence that bordered on euphoria. In small samples at the lab bench, it looked unremarkable. In the human body, it was transformative. Temmler's executives understood immediately that they had something marketable. Germany in the late 30s was a nation that could not afford to slow down. Housewives juggling endless shortages, laborers working double shifts, students preparing for a future dictated by ideology, all became natural customers. The company branded the substance Pervitin, packaged it in neat white boxes, and marketed it as a remedy for tiredness, low mood, and lack of concentration. It was sold at pharmacies without a prescription. The advertisements promised clarity, confidence, and stamina. Early buyers believed it. Doctors, too, were intrigued. They noted that patients taking Pervitin stayed awake longer, worked more efficiently, and spoke with bright, almost electric clarity. It didn't take long for the pills to spread through civilian life. University students used them to study through the night. Secretaries took them to keep pace with overwhelming office workloads. Drivers used them to stay awake during long shifts. Even writers and musicians experimented with them, calling them the pep pills. Inside the Wehrmacht's medical offices, the reports from Temmler raised eyebrows. A stimulant that could keep soldiers awake during long marches and night operations was no small discovery. Germany's military leadership understood that future wars would depend heavily on mobility, fast thrusts, long drives, relentless pressure. Blitzkrieg was not yet fully formed, but the concept of speed was already shaping military doctrine. A drug that erased fatigue could easily become a tactical asset. Initial testing was subtle, Pilots received small doses during overnight missions. Infantry units preparing for long training exercises were given tablets to assess endurance. The results were immediate and dramatic. Commanders reported that their men marched farther, reacted faster, and required fewer breaks. Pilots wrote that their minds felt unusually sharp, even after hours in the cockpit. The military physicians monitoring these tests were surprised by the consistency of the effects, but early warnings appeared just as quickly. Irritability, elevated heart rate, abrupt mood, shift signs that something powerful was working beneath the uniform. Some soldiers grew restless, others reckless. A few reported strange clarity that bordered on detachment. Yet the benefits, in the eyes of the high command, outweighed the risks. Germany was preparing for war. Fatigue was an obstacle. This new drug seemed to eliminate it. Pervitin's journey from laboratory experiment to battlefield tool had begun quietly, almost innocently. No one yet imagined how deeply it would intertwine with strategy, morale, and the psychology of the German soldier. But in the controlled calm of Temmler's laboratory, a foundation of a drug-fueled army was already taking shape one pill at a time. By the mid-1930s, Germany was a country running at full tilt. Every factory floor, every government office, every construction site hummed with a sense of urgency, pushed from the highest ranks. Hitler's promise of national rejuvenation demanded not only loyalty, but pace. Cities expanded, new highways carved through the countryside, and rearmament still technically illegal, drained manpower and resources at unprecedented speed. Men and women laboured harder, slept less, and pushed themselves far beyond what had been considered normal only a decade earlier. The national mood reflected this strain. Newspapers celebrated productivity like battlefield victories. Posters encouraged workers to give their all for the nation. Radio broadcasts praised men who worked double shifts, engineers who completed projects ahead of schedule, and mothers who maintained households while husbands drilled in the reserve units. Fatigue became a silent enemy, a sign of weakness in a society that worshipped momentum. Exhaustion was no excuse. The future of the Reich, people were told, required constant effort. Inside homes, the pressure was no less intense. Housewives faced shortages, rationing, and long lines as Germany prepared for war under the guise of peace. Children marched in youth organizations, expected to grow strong, disciplined, and tireless. Office clerks copied endless reports for expanding ministries. Students studied under new ideological rules, often late into the night. Everyone, in their own way, was being stretched. This environment created a demand not for luxury or comfort, but for stamina. The public wanted something to help them stay awake, to keep pace, to meet expectations. And the pharmaceutical industry delivered. Germany had long been a leader in chemical research. Its laboratories were precise, disciplined, and well-funded. By the time Pervitin appeared on the market, the public was already accustomed to medical products promising better concentration, calmer nerves, and improved mood. But this new tablet was different. It did not calm. It did not merely uplift, it ignited. Word spread quickly. Workers returning from night shifts praised the pills that kept them alert. Students whispered about how much more they could read before fatigue set in. Housewives spoke quietly among themselves, marvelling at how crisp and clear the world felt after a single dose. Doctors wrote cautious endorsements, noting improved focus and productivity. The drug's image was not one of danger, but of modern efficiency. Temmler capitalized on this moment. Advertisements showed bright-eyed women smiling through household chores, soldiers standing tall with renewed vigor, office staff working confidently at their desks. Pervitin was framed as a simple solution to the exhaustion woven into everyday life. A tablet taken with morning coffee, a small boost during long errands, a way to meet the demands the nation placed upon its citizens. In Berlin, the effects were even more visible. The capital's nightlife pulsed with new energy. Students from the universities bought tablets in bulk before exams. Streetcar conductors used them to stay awake on long routes. The city, already restless, seemed to vibrate with artificial clarity. Yet beneath the surface, something unsettling was forming. Families noticed that the pills made tempers short. Workers felt a sudden crash hours later, far sharper than natural tiredness. Doctors began seeing patients with trembling hands and racing hearts. But these warnings were quiet, overshadowed by the drug's apparent usefulness. Germany's search for energy, its hunger for speed, output, and strength, had opened the door for Pervitin. In a society where slowing down was seen as failure, methamphetamine did not appear dangerous. It appeared necessary, and the military was watching closely. When Pervitin officially entered German pharmacies in the late 1930s, it did so with no warning, no restrictions, and almost no skepticism. It was introduced like any other consumer product, boxed neatly, priced modestly, and advertised with the polished confidence of a modern pharmaceutical age. To the average German, it was simply a new medicine for tiredness, the sort of ailment that had quietly become one of the most common conditions in the country. The marketing was clever. Instead of speaking to soldiers or labourers directly, Temmler aimed first at civilians, especially women. Advertisements in newspapers and magazines showed elegant housewives gliding through their chores with bright smiles, refreshed and alert after taking a tablet for energy. Pervitin chocolates appeared next, small confections infused with methamphetamine, wrapped in pleasant paper that made them look harmless. These chocolates became especially popular among young mothers who needed to juggle childcare, ration lines, and household duties in a nation preparing for conflict. Doctors, influenced by early clinical reports and Temmler's promotional material, often recommended Pervitin for patients struggling with low mood, difficulty concentrating, or simple exhaustion. The pill's effect was quick and unmistakable. Heightened alertness, sharper reactions, a sudden lift in motivation. Patients returned to their doctors praising its benefits. Many asked for more. Berlin, already a restless city, became a testing ground for the drug's social impact. University students used Pervitin to cram for exams, some swallowing multiple tablets during long nights at the library. Office workers quietly took pills before long shifts, grateful for the surge of energy that helped them meet quotas. Postal workers, bank employees, tram drivers, the drug seeped into every corner of civilian labour without the public fully understanding what it was. Even among artists and intellectuals, the drug found its place. Writers spoke of sudden bursts of clarity that lasted hours. Musicians described a strange sense of rhythm and focus that made performances feel effortless. Dancers and actors whispered about it behind curtains, calling it the spark. What made Pervitin so appealing was its simplicity. It required no prescription. It was legal. It worked almost instantly, and it fit perfectly into a society where fatigue had become a silent national burden. But the early signs of danger appeared almost as quickly. Pharmacists reported customers returning sooner than expected, asking for another box. Housewives who had taken Pervitin to get through daily tasks found themselves restless late into the night, their thoughts racing. Students who relied on the tablets discovered that the crash afterward was brutal, an abrupt collapse into irritability and exhaustion. Some tried to fight the crash by taking another dose. Doctors began noting unusual symptoms: trembling hands, rapid pulse, sudden shifts in behavior. A few warned that the drug might be too strong, but their voices were quiet, drowned out by the pressure of a society that measured worth in productivity. The regime itself encouraged stamina and discipline. A tablet that helped people work harder, stay awake longer, and maintain the appearance of tireless enthusiasm aligned perfectly with the national narrative. Fatigue was weakness. Pervitin was strength. As the drug spread through shops, homes, universities, and workplaces, it became part of daily life, so common that few questioned what it really was. Civilians did not see a future battlefield stimulant. They saw convenience, relief, and a way to keep pace with expectations. None of them realized that these same pills would soon be handed out by medics in trench lines, aircraft, and armored columns. What began as an everyday energy boost was about to become a weapon of war. By the time the first winter of widespread civilian use arrived, Berlin had become the unofficial laboratory of Pervitin's social experiment. The capital, always a city of contrasts, order and chaos, discipline and indulgence, absorbed the drug faster and more visibly than anywhere else in Germany. What happened there would become the clearest window into how methamphetamine reshaped an entire population long before it ever fueled an army. Berlin's rhythm in the late 1930s was relentless. Factories roared on the outskirts, ministries worked under bright lamps late into the night, and the nightlife that had survived the regime's crackdown still pulsed beneath the surface. Cafes filled with students, artists, and clerks. Trams rattled through the streets before sunrise and after midnight. The city never truly slept, and now, with Pervitin, it didn't need to. Students at the University of Berlin were among the earliest adopters. Exam pressure was brutal, intensified by ideological demands and competitive scholarship systems. Pervitin offered a solution quick, cheap, and legal. Entire dormitories buzzed with sleepless ambition as young men and women studied for hours without blinking, their notes growing more frantic as the pills pushed them far past natural limits. Professors quietly noticed the difference: brighter eyes, faster speech, and sudden crashes that left students pale and irritable. Office workers in government ministries followed soon after. Germany's expanding bureaucracy required endless paperwork reports, quotas, production reviews, all demanding precision and speed. Clerks discovered that a single tablet made the day feel clearer, lighter, more manageable. Supervisors encouraged anything that improved output. The pill that began as a convenience quickly became a hidden expectation. Berlin's nightlife, though subdued compared to the Weimar era, found its own use for the drug. Cabaret performers and musicians used Pervitin to power through exhausting schedules. Bartenders slipped tablets to tired patrons who needed a lift after long shifts. Small circles of writers and intellectuals, some loyal to the regime, others quietly critical, experimented with the drug as they debated politics, philosophy, and the future of Europe deep into the night. Conversations grew sharper but also stranger. Artists described moments of piercing clarity, followed by hours of jittery restlessness. Factory workers were more cautious, but not immune. Long shifts and strict production targets left little room for mistakes. When a foreman took Pervitin and finished his shift with unusual energy, others noticed. Word spread. Soon, some factories saw workers dividing tablets among themselves before difficult tasks. Productivity increased. Accidents did too. Even homemakers in the capital, already stretched thin by shortages and the pressures of ideological motherhood, used Pervitin to maintain composure and keep pace. Women wrote in private diaries about the pills helping them endure sleepless nights with infants, long queues for food, and the emotional strain of husbands returning late from military drills. They did not think of addiction or danger. They thought of survival. Doctors in Berlin began to raise the first real concerns. Patients reported heart palpitations, insomnia, sudden bursts of anxiety, and disorienting paranoia. A few arrived at clinics, shaking uncontrollably, their eyes darting as if trying to escape something unseen. But in a society obsessed with productivity, these warnings were quietly ignored. The government, too, watched with calculated interest. A population that worked harder, faster, and with fewer complaints suited the national agenda. Fatigue was a liability. Pervitin was an advantage. Berlin had become the proving ground not by official decree, but by the natural tension of a city that demanded more energy than its people could naturally give. The pills blurred the line between effort and compulsion, clarity and overdrive, and as the capital embraced this new stimulant, the military took careful notes. What happened in Berlin was not simply a trend. It was a preview, a glimpse of what a drug-enhanced nation, and soon a drug-driven army, might look like when fatigue ceased to be a natural limit and became something chemically erased. While Berlin's civilians were discovering Pervitin in their kitchens, classrooms, and workplaces, another set of eyes was quietly observing the drug's rising influence. The Wehrmacht's medical and logistical departments, Germany's military, constrained publicly by the Treaty of Versailles, but rearming rapidly behind closed doors, was under immense pressure to prepare for the fast, modern, highly mobile war that Hitler envisioned. Speed, endurance, and mental resilience were becoming as important as rifles and tanks. Inside the Wehrmacht's medical academy in Berlin, physicians evaluated every new pharmaceutical product entering the civilian market. Their interest in Pervitin began not with a directive, but with whispers, reports of students studying through the night, factory workers completing double shifts without rest, and housewives claiming renewed stamina. Doctors were trained to be skeptical, yet the consistency of these accounts drew their attention. A stimulant that boosted concentration and erased fatigue was not merely a medical curiosity. It was a potential military asset. In late 1938, the first internal memos circulated among senior medical officers. They summarized Temmler's promotional claims, civilian testimonials, and early scientific findings. The memos questioned whether the drug could help soldiers stay awake during prolonged marches, maintain alertness during night patrols, or withstand the mental strain of extended operations. For a military still rebuilding its strength and preparing for rapid lightning warfare, these possibilities were intriguing. The timing was significant. Blitzkrieg, as a concept, was taking shape, not yet fully formalized, but deeply rooted in the essential idea of unbroken momentum. Panzer columns needed to move relentlessly. Pilots had to fly long sorties under extreme pressure. Infantry units required the mental toughness to march, fight, and hold positions with minimal rest. War, at least the kind Germany intended to fight, was becoming a test of endurance as much as strategy. Medical officers began informal discussions with Temmler representatives. They requested detailed pharmacological data, studies, and pilot reports. Temmler, already eager to expand its market, cooperated fully. The company framed Pervitin as safe, effective, and modern a pharmaceutical tool suited to the disciplined strength of the German soldier. Soon, samples were delivered to army clinics. Military doctors conducted quiet trials, giving small doses to soldiers during routine exercises. The results were hard to ignore. Troops reported heightened alertness, improved morale, and an ability to push through tasks that normally left them exhausted. Some officers noted that their men marched faster, reacted more quickly during drills, and remained unusually focused during long instructional sessions. But the reactions were not uniformly positive. A minority of soldiers described racing hearts, restlessness, and an unfamiliar inner agitation. A few complained of difficulty sleeping for long periods after taking the pills. Others reported irritability or sudden episodes of frustration. Yet these side effects were overshadowed by the drug's perceived benefits. Commanders receiving the early reports were intrigued. A stimulant that allowed soldiers to surpass natural limits fit neatly into the military's growing emphasis on relentless forward motion. War would demand days without rest, nights without sleep, and decisions made under crushing fatigue. If a pill could delay exhaustion even temporarily, it would be difficult to ignore. By early 1939, Pervitin was no longer a subject of casual study. It had become a matter of military planning. The Wehrmacht did not yet issue it officially, nor did they openly, to acknowledge its interest. But the corridors of military medicine buzzed with quiet speculation. Officers spoke cautiously, aware that such a drug could reshape battlefield endurance. They also understood that it might reshape discipline and judgment. Germany was preparing for war, and as the military observed the drug spreading through civilian life, one question grew louder. If this pill could make ordinary Germans work and study beyond their limits, what could it do for soldiers marching toward the next conflict? Inside the administrative buildings of the Wehrmacht, information did not travel freely. Reports, medical notes, and experimental findings passed through narrow channels, stamped with classifications that determined who could read them and who could not. By mid-1939, Pervitin had earned its own place in this network of restricted communication. The drug was no longer treated as a civilian curiosity. It was quietly entering the domain of military secrecy. The first confidential file, labeled Verschlussage, classified matter, summarized early tests conducted with select infantry and Luftwaffe personnel. It documented changes in alertness, reaction time, stamina, and decision-making. The tone was clinical, almost detached, but between the lines a clear conclusion emerged. Methamphetamine could push soldiers well beyond natural limits. For commanders planning a new style of rapid warfare, this was not a footnote. It was a potential tool. These files circulated among senior medical officers, never reaching the general ranks. Each document followed the same format: dosage tests, duration of effect, side effects, operational observations, and recommendations. What stood out most were the entries describing prolonged wakefulness. Soldiers remained alert for 36 hours, sometimes longer. Pilots reported heightened focus on night missions, with fewer errors in instrument readings. Infantrymen on extended marches showed improved coordination after taking small doses, but the files also recorded the cracks beneath the surface. Sporadic notes mentioned overstimulation, loss of emotional restraint, and temporary visual disturbances. One Luftwaffe medic described a pilot who, after 12 hours without rest, felt as though the cockpit instruments were too bright, flickering when they were not. Another report described a soldier who became uncharacteristically reckless during a field exercise, charging faster than his squad and ignoring minor instructions. Afterward, he could not recall the moment clearly. Still, the tone of the classified assessments leaned toward acceptance rather than caution. Germany was preparing for a war of movement, one that required soldiers to march through nights, execute lightning assaults, and react instantly to changing conditions. The drug's risks seemed manageable, its benefits potentially transformative. In the offices of the Luftwaffe's medical department, enthusiasm grew quickly. Night fighters, reconnaissance pilots, and bomber crews operated under extreme fatigue. Methamphetamine offered a way to counteract the exhaustion inherent in long missions. Reports from aviation medicine highlighted how the drug elevated morale and reduced hesitation during critical decisions. These findings were copied, stamped, and forwarded to higher authorities, gaining support with each layer of approval. The Army's medical division was more cautious, noting concerns about long-term dependency and psychological strain. But even these warnings were softened by the acknowledgement that war placed demands no natural human stamina could sustain. Military medicine had long accepted that painkillers, sedatives, and stimulants were part of warfare. Pervitin was simply a new entry in an old category, one that happened to be unusually strong. By the summer of 1939, additional files were compiled, each thicker than the last. Charts, behavioral notes, and pilot testimonies filled the pages. One report described the drug as valuable for overcoming the decisive hours of fatigue that determine the outcome of mobile operations. Another concluded that Pervitin merits further controlled distribution. The files remained locked in steel cabinets, accessible only to select officers. No public announcement was made. No official directive yet existed, but the path was clear. Germany was moving toward war at speed, and within the classified archives of the Wehrmacht, methamphetamine was no longer a question. It was an asset. The only decision left was how widely it would be used when the first shots were fired. The military's earliest experiments with Pervitin were not conducted on the front lines, but in controlled spaces, airfields, training grounds, and medical facilities where observations could be made quietly and with precision. These were not broad distributions. The Wehrmacht wanted certainty, not speculation. Before issuing a drug to thousands of soldiers, they needed to understand exactly what it could do, how long it acted, and where it pushed men beyond their limits. The Luftwaffe moved first. Night operations were among the most demanding tasks in the German armed forces. Pilots flew long sorties, often in poor weather, guided only by faint instrument panels and intermittent radio communications. Fatigue was as dangerous as enemy fire. When the first small batch of Pervitin tablets arrived at several air bases, flight surgeons administered them to select pilots during extended training flights. The results were unmistakable. Reaction times sharpened, decision-making accelerated, and pilots reported increased clarity even after hours in the air. One flight surgeon recorded a test in which a pilot remained alert and mentally focused during a simulated 9-hour mission without experiencing the usual decline in performance. Another noted that pilots showed heightened confidence, though he added quietly that some seemed too confident, pushing maneuvers more aggressively than they normally would. Still, the overall impression was positive enough to capture the interest of high-ranking Luftwaffe commanders. Meanwhile, the army conducted its own experiments on infantry units. These tests involved long marches, nighttime navigation drills, and endurance exercises that often lasted until dawn. Military doctors observed soldiers carefully, noting physical markers, heart rate, coordination, and stamina. The changes were immediate. Troops on Pervitin marched farther, complained less, and maintained formation longer. Instructors noticed sharper responses during late-night drills, when fatigue usually dulled the edges of discipline. But the experiments also revealed the first signs of imbalance. Some soldiers grew restless and irritable after several hours, showing agitation that interfered with teamwork. Others became overly talkative or displayed an unusual degree of enthusiasm for tasks normally approached with straightforward discipline. A small number reported feeling their thoughts race or fragment. No one yet recognized these as early symptoms of methamphetamine's psychological effects. They were simply noted, filed, and submitted for review. Among the more concerning behaviors were the sudden energy crashes. After the stimulant wore off, a few soldiers experienced profound exhaustion deeper than ordinary tiredness. Their bodies seemed to sag into the earth, their muscles heavy, their minds dulled. It was as if the drug had borrowed energy from the future and demanded repayment all at once. Medical officers recorded these episodes, but, at this early stage, saw them as manageable side effects. Despite the warnings, enthusiasm grew. The trials produced exactly what Germany's military planners wanted: evidence that a stimulant could sustain long operations, extend marches, and keep pilots alert during critical missions. The drug's risks appeared small compared to its potential strategic value. The trials expanded quietly. Additional units received tablets for evaluation. Reports flowed back to command headquarters with the same conclusions: improved stamina, sharper focus, reduced need for sleep. The few cautionary notes were buried among pages of optimistic observations. No order had yet been issued to supply the entire army. No official policy existed, but the direction was set. Within the walls of the Wehrmacht's medical divisions, a quiet resolve took. Pervitin worked. It made soldiers faster, more alert, more tireless. The next question was no longer whether the German army would use it, but how much they would depend on it when war finally erupted. As the trials expanded across select Wehrmacht units, a pattern began to emerge, one that officers could neither ignore nor fully explain. Soldiers on Pervitin were not simply less tired, they were operating on a different level of endurance, one that seemed to rewrite the limits of the human body. The reports arriving at headquarters described results so unusual that some commanders wondered whether the drug could give Germany a decisive edge before the first shot of the coming war was even fired. The earliest evidence came from infantry training marches. Units given tablets before, long-distance exercises moved with an uncanny consistency. Normally, after several hours of marching under full kit, fatigue became visible in the slope of shoulders and the unevenness of a formation. But with Pervitin, soldiers held their pace as if the kilometers meant little. Their movements were crisp, their posture firm, their footsteps steady. One instructor noted that a company marched through an entire night without showing the usual signs of strain, a feat he described as highly irregular, bordering on unnatural. In the barracks, after these marches, the difference became even more striking. While control groups collapsed into sleep, the soldiers who had taken Pervitin remained awake, sitting on bunks with bright, alert eyes, discussing plans or polishing equipment long after midnight. A few even volunteered for additional tasks, insisting they felt fresh. Officers overseeing the tests found this behavior productive but perplexing. Men were not meant to function at this pace, and yet, under the influence of the tablets, they did. Similar findings emerged from armored units, panzer crews, whose training required intense coordination in cramped metal interiors, usually tired quickly in the heat and noise of the vehicles. But when given Pervitin, crews stayed focused through extended drills, communication sharpened, reaction times improved. Some tank commanders reported feeling as though they could anticipate their drivers' actions before they happened, a heightened, almost mechanical clarity that made training exercises run more smoothly than ever before. The Luftwaffe reported its own peculiar data. Night fighters and reconnaissance pilots, normally worn down by the strain of flying through darkness, remained unnervingly alert during long missions. One pilot wrote that after 8 hours in the air, he felt as awake as at the start, with senses finely tuned, as if the night sky itself had slowed around him. Another described a feeling of quiet confidence that persisted even during difficult maneuvers. Flight surgeons documented these accounts with interest, quietly noting the possibility of extending operational ranges and mission duration. But alongside these impressive results came subtle warnings. The strange endurance was not without cost. Soldiers sometimes demonstrated bursts of jittery enthusiasm, rushing tasks with excessive speed or misjudging distances during drills. A few misinterpreted commands, responding too quickly rather than accurately. Others developed a sharp edge to their behavior, a restlessness that bordered on agitation. The drug made them sharper, yes, but also unpredictable. Medical officers noticed another pattern. When the effects wore off, they did so abruptly. The crash was sudden and severe. Men who had shown remarkable stamina hours earlier now sat slumped, pale, and unfocused, as though the energy had been ripped out of them all at once. Some trembled. Others struggled to articulate simple thoughts. These episodes alarmed the physicians, but seemed to concern the commanders far less. The crashes were inconvenient, but manageable. The endurance was what mattered. In staff meetings, senior officers began to speculate openly. Could Pervitin help create an army capable of marching faster and farther than any opponent expected? Could the drug reduce the need for rest, allowing Germany to strike with unprecedented speed? Could fatigue, one of the oldest and most reliable limits of warfare, be erased chemically? No formal decisions had yet been made, but the strange new endurance on display in these trials was undeniable. Germany had found something powerful, something that could reshape the tempo of war itself. And for a nation preparing to launch a conflict of movement and shock, that possibility was irresistible. Inside the upper floors of the Wehrmacht's command buildings, far from the barracks and training fields where soldiers first experienced Pervitin, the mood was far more cautious. Germany was preparing for a war that demanded precision, not chaos, and any new tool, no matter how promising, required scrutiny. By early 1939, the stimulant had reached the desks of generals, medical chiefs, and staff planners. What followed was a quiet but serious debate that revealed the tension between military necessity and medical responsibility. The earliest discussions took place in small conference rooms filled with cigarette smoke and the murmur of clipped, deliberate voices. Senior physicians presented findings from the first trials. Enhanced endurance, increased alertness, extended wakefulness. They laid out charts showing march durations, pilot performance, and reaction times. Most officers listened with interest. A stimulant that could keep soldiers awake through crucial operations was no trivial matter. But then came the other numbers, the side effects: heart palpitations, agitation, sudden emotional volatility, hallucinations in rare cases, and the sharp crashes that followed extended use. A few medical officers warned that the drug acted on the body with extraordinary force. They described episodes where soldiers pushed themselves so hard under the influence that their bodies seemed to collapse afterward. General staff officers reacted with mixed expressions. Some leaned forward, intrigued. Others frowned, wary. The concept of a chemically enhanced army appealed to the boldest minds, those who imagined war not as a slow grind but as a rapid assault, a race in which the fastest, most tireless army would dictate the outcome. Yet, discipline was the backbone of the German military. Anything that risked impairing judgment or inflaming rash behavior threatened that backbone. In one notable meeting, a senior Luftwaffe officer argued passionately for expanded use. The stimulant, he claimed, could give pilots the edge needed for night operations and long missions. Fatigue, he said, is the enemy's greatest ally. His words resonated with commanders who understood how easily exhaustion could turn precision into disaster. But the Army's medical division opposed the idea of widespread distribution. One colonel warned that dependence could become a problem. Another noted that soldiers sometimes displayed overconfidence, a dangerous trait in combat. A single impulsive action by an overstimulated soldier could compromise an entire operation. The debates grew more intense as Pervitin's field reports continued to stream in. Some divisions praised the improved stamina during marches and drills. Others sent cautionary notes describing erratic nighttime behavior or unexpected lapses in judgment. One classified memo titled "Observations on Emotional Instability After Extended Use" circulated briefly among commanders before being locked away in a restricted archive. Hitler himself never participated directly in the discussions, but his expectations cast a long shadow. He envisioned a war of speed, lightning strikes, rapid encirclements, and constant motion, a stimulant that erased. Sleep sounded compatible with this vision. High-ranking officers knew that anything enabling faster mobilization would likely be viewed favorably by the Führer. This unspoken pressure tilted the debate. By late summer, the question had shifted from "should we use Pervitin" to "how broadly should we distribute it?" Some argued for limiting it to pilots, tank crews, and specialized units. Others pushed for issuing it across the infantry to maximize mobility. A few insisted that medical oversight was essential, but their voices softened as the urgency of impending war grew sharper. The High Command never reached a unanimous conclusion. Instead, the realities of preparing for a massive offensive began to overshadow theoretical concerns. If the drug could help soldiers push through critical hours, the hours on which entire campaigns might pivot, then its risks seemed acceptable. Ethics receded, strategy advanced. The debates ended not with a decision stamped in ink, but with a silence that carried its own approval. Pervitin was no longer a question for the future. It was becoming an instrument of the present one that would soon accompany soldiers into the first battles of the new war. By the final months of 1939, with war already burning in Poland and preparations accelerating for a much larger conflict to the west, the German High Command reached a point of quiet inevitability. The debates, the medical reports, the cautious memos, all of it converged on a single strategic truth. Modern war moved too fast for human bodies to keep up. Fatigue was no longer just a weakness. It was an obstacle to the type of warfare Hitler expected the Wehrmacht to unleash across Europe. Inside a sealed conference room in the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, senior officers sat around a long polished table, reviewing the latest trial summaries. Maps of future offensives were pinned to the walls, marked with arrows that stretched across hundreds of kilometers. Blitzkrieg demanded pace, relentless, unforgiving pace. Infantry would march through the night. armoured. Divisions would drive until engines groaned, and pilots would fly repeated sorties on the thinnest margins of rest. The commanders knew this tempo could break men as easily as it would break enemies. The solution lay in the small white tablets already circulating in classified channels. The final medical report, stamped Hochgeheim, top secret, focused less on risk and more on operational advantage. It emphasized that Pervitin reduced the need for sleep, accelerated reaction time, and sharpened focus during critical windows. It acknowledged side effects but downplayed them in the context of rapid offensive operations. In essence, the document stated what many officers were already thinking. The benefits aligned perfectly with the demands of Blitzkrieg. The decision did not come in the form of dramatic proclamation. It arrived quietly, almost bureaucratically. A formal directive approved the controlled but widespread distribution of Pervitin to troops involved in high-mobility operations. The pills would be issued through medics at the discretion of commanding officers. Officially, they were categorized not as combat drugs, but as stimulant supplements. Unofficially, they were a weapon, one that targeted the biological limits of the human body. With that decision, fatigue itself became something the Wehrmacht sought to suppress, overcome, and if possible, eliminate entirely. If the enemy relied on cycles of rest, Germany intended to do the opposite: move when others slept, attack when others paused, and maintain momentum beyond what any adversary believed possible. Logistical preparations began immediately. Temmler increased production, working around the clock. Boxes of Pervitin were packed into crates, marked with innocuous inventory labels. Shipments were routed through military pharmacies, supply depots, and field hospitals. Commanders received quiet briefings on appropriate use and expected benefits. Many needed little convincing. They had seen the field trials, read the reports, and understood the operational value. At the same time, the Luftwaffe requested priority supplies. Night missions were particularly draining, and Pervitin offered a way to extend pilot endurance during crucial operations. Tank units soon followed, recognizing that a drug capable of keeping crews alert inside cramped armored interiors could significantly improve combat efficiency. There were still concerns. Several medical officers questioned whether pushing soldiers beyond natural limits would lead to sudden collapses during prolonged campaigns. Some worried about dependence, psychological instability, or long-term consequences. But the tempo of war overtook these doubts. Every operation in planning required more speed, more stamina, more endurance than the last. Commanders were no longer looking at the long-term health of soldiers. They were looking at the next offensive, the next breakthrough, the next victory. By the winter of 1939, Pervitin was no longer an experiment. It was part of the German war machine, a chemical accelerator designed to keep men awake, alert, and in motion when the demands of Blitzkrieg exceeded anything the human body was built to withstand. Germany had found a way to weaponize fatigue itself, and the world was about to witness what happened when an army marched faster than its own limits. When German forces crossed into Poland on the 1st of September, 1939, the world witnessed the opening act of a new kind of war, fast, coordinated, and brutally efficient. But hidden beneath the armoured thrusts and roaring Luftwaffe squadrons was something far quieter: the first real battlefield use of Pervitin on a significant scale. The stimulant that had already transformed training grounds and trial exercises was now carried in the pockets of soldiers marching into an actual war. The campaign's pace became the first true test. As dawn broke along the Polish frontier, infantry units advanced under orders to maintain momentum regardless of terrain or resistance. The terrain varied sharply: thick forests, muddy roads, scattered villages, but the operational goal remained the same: keep moving. In previous conflicts, such rapid advance would have been impossible. Even the best trained soldiers needed cycles of rest, food, and recovery. But this war, the one Germany intended to fight, was designed to outrun its own exhaustion. In the week before the invasion, select commanders quietly issued tablets from small, unlabeled tins. Officially, they were stimulants for alertness during extended operations. Unofficially, they were the first combat rations of a drug-fueled army. Soldiers took them cautiously at first. Some were unsure, others were curious. A few welcomed anything that made the long nights of anticipation easier to endure. But once the fighting began, the effects quickly became apparent. Infantrymen pushed deep into Polish territory with a stamina that startled even their own officers. Units that had marched all day continued to press forward through the night, their footsteps steady long after the natural limits of fatigue should have slowed them. One regimental report described a battalion that covered nearly twice the expected distance in a 48-hour period. Another noted that sentries posted after long marches remained unusually alert, scanning fields and tree lines with bright, unwavering eyes. Panzer crews displayed similar endurance. The inside of a tank was a punishing environment, hot, cramped, deafening, and normally, exhaustion came quickly. Yet during the invasion, some crews stayed operational far longer than the medical staff anticipated. Commanders praised their sharp response times and relentless focus. Combat logs showed fewer errors in navigation and coordination during long drives than during previous training exercises. Officers attributed much of this to discipline and adrenaline, but the medical officers reading the after-action reports understood the deeper truth. The Luftwaffe also integrated Pervitin more directly. Pilots flying repeated low-altitude bombing runs over Polish defences reported heightened concentration and reduced disorientation during long missions. For those conducting reconnaissance flights at night or in poor weather, the stimulant helped counter the mental fog that often crept in after hours in the cockpit. Flight surgeons documented these improvements, but also noted early warnings: irritability, a tendency toward overconfidence, and sporadic episodes of aggressive maneuvering that exceeded standard protocols. Despite such concerns, the results were viewed through the lens of success. Poland fell with shocking speed weeks instead of months. German commanders credited strategy, armour coordination, and air superiority. But within the medical and logistical corridors of the Wehrmacht, another conclusion circulated quietly. Pervitin had helped maintain the relentless tempo demanded by Blitzkrieg, yet beneath the triumph, subtle cracks showed. After the drug wore off, some soldiers collapsed into deep, immobilizing exhaustion. Others experienced trembling hands, sudden chills, or difficulty focusing. A few reported confusion or emotional instability after multiple days with little rest. These incidents appeared sporadic, overshadowed by the campaign's quick victory, and thus were not taken as serious warnings. Germany drew one lesson most clearly: a stimulant that kept soldiers awake during the critical opening days of an invasion had strategic value. And as plans shifted toward the west, toward France, the Netherlands, and Belgium, the High Command began preparing to distribute Pervitin on a scale far larger than anything used in Poland. The next campaign would demand even more speed, even more endurance, and even less time for sleep. The drug that had entered Poland quietly would enter Western Europe as a standard tool of war. After the quick collapse of Poland, German planners studied every aspect of the campaign. They examined the timing of armoured thrusts, the coordination between ground units and the Luftwaffe, and the performance of soldiers during prolonged operations. Amid the flood of reports and logistics, summaries, one conclusion kept resurfacing: units that used Pervitin maintained momentum far beyond expected limits. Sleep, once an unavoidable constraint of war, had, in some cases, been pushed aside. This realization struck at the core of German strategic doctrine. Blitzkrieg was not merely a tactic, it was a race. Every hour mattered. Every kilometre gained before the enemy reorganized increased the likelihood of victory. Fatigue, in this context, was more than a biological function. It was an impediment to the tempo Germany sought to impose on all future fronts. Pervitin, therefore, was not seen simply as a stimulant. It was viewed as a means to remove one of war's oldest barriers. In the months following the Polish campaign, the Wehrmacht conducted more structured endurance tests. These exercises were designed not for combat training but for measuring human limits under chemically induced wakefulness. Infantry companies were instructed to march for 24 hours without rest, then perform tactical drills under simulated combat stress. Units given Pervitin demonstrated extraordinary stamina. Their movements stayed coordinated, their voices sharp, their reactions quick even after a full day and night of exertion. Medical officers documented these results with clinical detachment. Reduction in sleep requirement noted. Cognitive performance retained. Morale elevated after 30 hours awake. In quieter notes, they also logged the crash's sudden collapse, shaking hands, stretched nerves, but in the larger evaluation, the benefits overshadowed the risks. Within armoured divisions, the drug's impact became even more pronounced. Panzer crews were pushed through extended driving drills meant to simulate breakthrough operations. Normally, exhaustion set in quickly. Tank interiors grew stifling, fumes thickened, and continuous concentration drained the men. But with Pervitin, crews pushed through the second night of operation with startling alertness. Some even insisted they could continue indefinitely. Commanders, wary but impressed, noted the possibility of running tanks through entire 48-hour operations without relief. Crews a significant tactical advantage. The Luftwaffe expanded its trials openly within night fighter units. Long nocturnal patrols had always been mentally brutal. Hours spent alone in the dark sky, surrounded by monotony, punctured only by brief surges of danger. Pilots using Pervitin reported a sense of clarity that extended far beyond natural endurance. Flight surgeons, cautious but curious, believed the drug could drastically improve mission effectiveness during the long nights expected in Western Europe. Still, concerns grew quietly in medical files. Sleep deprivation, even when chemically delayed, carried its own psychological cost. Some soldiers became irritable, snapping at comrades for minor issues. Others displayed reckless enthusiasm during drills, charging ahead with an aggression that defied normal discipline. A few experienced the world with unnatural intensity, as if senses were sharpened too far. But with war against France and Britain looming, few officers saw these as reasons for restraint. The High Command issued new guidelines, though phrased with bureaucratic delicacy. Stimulants were to be used to maintain operational readiness during periods of extended wakefulness. Behind these words was a simple meaning. Soldiers would take Pervitin when the situation demanded speed, and in Blitzkrieg, the situation always demanded speed. In the end, the tests confirmed what commanders had hoped and doctors had feared. Pervitin did not merely help soldiers stay awake. It changed their relationship with sleep itself. Men who should have collapsed after 20 hours continued marching. Pilots who should have faltered during late-night missions remained vigilant. Tank crews who should have disengaged to rest kept their engines rumbling long past the point of common sense. Germany now believed it had found a chemical key to sustaining the relentless pressure that defined its new style of warfare. The need for sleep, one of humanity's most fundamental constraints, had been broken, and the next campaigns would push that limit even further, with consequences the High Command had not yet begun to comprehend. The inside of a German panzer was a world of metal, heat, and constant motion. Even in training, the conditions were unforgiving. Cramped compartments, stale air thick with oil fumes, engines rumbling so loud that the vibrations crawled into the bones. In combat, these hardships intensified. Smoke from burning vehicles, sudden concussive blasts, the grinding of treads over uneven terrain. Tank warfare required relentless focus. Fatigue was not merely inconvenient, it was dangerous. A moment's lapse could mean missing an enemy position or misinterpreting a commander's order. It was in this environment that Pervitin began to show a different kind of value. During the months between the campaigns in Poland and Western Europe, armoured divisions trained aggressively for rapid, deep penetration manoeuvres. Panzer units were expected to move faster and farther than any German force had ever done. The long, continuous drives demanded a level of alertness that natural stamina could not sustain. Officers overseeing training soon noticed that the stimulant already being used by infantry and pilots had an even more pronounced effect inside the steel confines of a tank. Reports from early tank trials revealed something close to transformation. Crews who took Pervitin remained intensely focused through long operational drills that normally pushed men into exhaustion. Drivers responded quicker to shifting terrain, guiding the vehicle with a confidence that impressed instructors. Radio operators stayed sharp through hours of fractured communication, catching details that fatigue would normally blur. Gunners tracked targets with steady hands even after extended training scenarios. Commanders, perched half out of the turret, reported a feeling of clarity that allowed them to scan landscapes more intensely and anticipate enemy movements. The stimulant seemed to amplify the crew's cohesion. Tanks operated not as a group of overstressed individuals but as a single machine, synchronized and efficient. Some officers praised the effect as heightened coordination, noting fewer operational mistakes during long sessions. A Panzer instructor remarked that certain crews appeared as if operating on a single continuous line of energy, but inside the medical notes, another reality stirred. Tank crews on Pervitin often pushed themselves beyond safe limits. The drug dulled the body's warnings, the subtle cues of exhaustion, dehydration, and tension that normally forced rest. Drivers sometimes pressed forward too aggressively, underestimating terrain hazards. Gunners, fueled by an artificial sense of precision, occasionally overextended themselves during rapid target changes. And commanders, feeling heightened confidence, issued bold orders that worked brilliantly in training, but raised concerns about real combat implications. The crash that followed was particularly harsh inside armoured units. When the effects wore off, tank crews felt it immediately. Some described a sudden fog settling over their minds, as if clarity had been switched off. Others experienced trembling hands, muscle weakness, or emotional withdrawal. A few became unusually quiet, staring into the metal walls of the vehicle as if trying to steady themselves. These effects were documented, but often dismissed with a single remark: rest period required. Still, the tactical benefits overshadowed the warnings. Blitzkrieg relied on unbroken momentum, and tanks were the spearhead of that momentum. If Pervitin allowed Panzer units to Pervitin, advance through the night, execute coordinated maneuvers without rest, and overwhelm enemy defences before dawn, then commanders deemed it indispensable. By early 1940, shipments of Pervitin were being routed directly to armoured divisions. Medical officers distributed tablets with short, efficient briefings. Use during extended operations. Maintain discipline. Do not exceed recommended dosage. But everyone understood that enforcement would be nearly impossible once the fighting began. Inside a tank surrounded by chaos, the imperative was simple: stay awake, stay sharp, stay alive. As armoured divisions prepared for the massive offensive into the west, Panzer commanders reviewed their plans with renewed confidence. They knew their machines were powerful, they knew their strategy was bold, and now they believed their crews could remain alert, longer, push harder, and strike deeper than any enemy anticipated. Pervitin had woven itself into the steel nerve of Germany's armoured forces. The quiet pill taken in a dim barracks would soon drive tanks through Europe at a pace the world had never seen and would never forget. As Germany prepared for its sweeping offensive in the West, medical officers and unit commanders began receiving field notes that bordered on the unbelievable. Scattered across infantry, armoured, and Luftwaffe divisions were reports describing men who had remained awake not for a single night, nor even for 2, but for nearly 72 hours. These accounts, first treated with skepticism, soon became undeniable as similar observations poured in from unrelated units. The earliest of these reports came from an infantry battalion posted near the Siegfried Line during extended readiness. Drills. A platoon tasked with overnight patrols had been issued Pervitin before a 40-kilometre march. According to their lieutenant, the men completed the trek, rested briefly, and then volunteered to continue with reconnaissance duties that stretched well into the next night. The lieutenant noted that their speech was fast, their gestures sharp, and their eyes unusually bright. Only when the third night approached did the soldiers begin showing signs of frayed nerves, but even then, many insisted they were still fit for duty. Similar accounts emerged from panzer units. 1. Tank crew, tasked with executing continuous maneuver exercises, operated their vehicle without meaningful rest for 3 consecutive days. Their commander wrote that the men appeared tireless, rotating positions inside the vehicle with mechanical precision. Only after the exercise concluded did the crew nearly collapse, the energy drained from their bodies in a matter of minutes. The after-action report recommended cautious praise for their stamina and urgent rest to counteract the drug's crash. The most striking accounts, however, came from the Luftwaffe. Pilots, conducting long-duration navigation missions, reported that Pervitin allowed them to remain awake and alert through entire cycles of day and night. One reconnaissance pilot described a surreal sensation. The sky felt clearer. My thoughts were faster than the aircraft. His report also mentioned an unsettling aftermath, a trembling in his hands that persisted for hours after landing, accompanied by what he called a colder kind of exhaustion. Flight surgeons, though impressed by the stimulant's tactical benefits, discreetly recorded these troubling observations. Some pilots became overly confident, attempting sharper climbs or riskier maneuvers, convinced their reflexes were infallible. Others developed a detached calm during missions, bordering on emotional numbness. These traits were manageable during controlled drills, but in combat they could mean the difference between success and self-destruction. Yet the High Command viewed the "awake for 3 days" reports not as warnings, but as opportunities. Blitzkrieg demanded uninterrupted drive. Speed was its foundation, pressure its weapon. If soldiers could fight through the critical first, 72 hours of an offensive, the hours when enemy lines buckled or held, then the stimulant would serve a strategic function far greater than any single piece of equipment. Medical staff quietly pushed back. They argued that prolonged sleep deprivation, even when mitigated by stimulants, could impair judgment, distort perception, and provoke psychological instability. Some documented hallucinations, shadows mistaken for enemy movement, voices heard in silent forests, phantom lights perceived on the horizon. But these accounts were filed under transient side effects, overshadowed by the drug's undeniable utility in keeping soldiers moving. The Wehrmacht's leadership faced a fundamental question. What mattered more, the long-term health of a soldier or the short-term momentum of an army? The answer, shaped by strategy rather than humanity, became increasingly clear. The stimulant was achieving what planners needed. Men were pushing far past natural limits. Entire units remained on their feet long after exhaustion should have crippled them. The early victories reinforced the belief that Blitzkrieg was unstoppable, and Pervitin became entwined with that illusion of invincibility. The "awake for 3 days" phenomenon was no longer an anomaly. It was becoming an expectation, a new standard for the soldiers of the Reich, one the human body was never designed to meet. As the Wehrmacht prepared for its massive offensives in Western Europe, planners focused not only on fuel, ammunition, and rations, but on something no previous army in history had needed to supply: methamphetamine. By early 1940, Pervitin had become woven into Germany's operational doctrine, a quiet but essential ingredient in sustaining the unforgiving tempo of Blitzkrieg. The question now was not whether the drug would be used, but how an army of millions could be supplied with it efficiently and discreetly. The logistical challenge began at the factories. Temmler, the pharmaceutical company responsible for producing Pervitin, increased its output dramatically after receiving military contracts. Production lines ran around the clock, packaging tablets into small cardboard boxes that resembled vitamin kits more than battlefield materials. Workers were not told the full purpose of the drug. They were informed only that it was for the troops, a phrase that silenced further questions in a country where asking the wrong one carried quiet consequences. From the factories, shipments moved to military depots under generic labels medical supplies. 3. Field stimulants, or simply Tableton. These crates were stacked beside morphine, disinfectants, and bandages, blending into the vast machinery that sustained a modern war. Only a small number of officers knew what the pills really were. Even fewer understood their full effects. Distribution to units followed the rhythms of standard medical logistics. Field hospitals, regimental aid posts, and unit medics received tins of Pervitin alongside routine pharmaceuticals. The official instructions were vague. Administer during extended operations or when maintaining. Alertness is essential. But in practice, the guidelines were interpreted loosely. Medics often issued the pills at the request of officers preparing for nighttime marches or high-pressure maneuvers. In some cases, soldiers requested the tablets directly, having learned through training that they could rely on them to push through long hours. As the Western offensive approached, demand surged. Panzer divisions preparing for deep penetration maneuvers received priority shipments. Luftwaffe units engaged in reconnaissance and night operations were allocated larger quantities. Infantry divisions expected to march rapidly through Belgium and northern France were likewise stocked. The stimulant had quietly become as essential as fuel, a chemical resource that enabled Germany's soldiers to operate at a speed and intensity that planners believed would overwhelm opponents before they could mount an organized defense. But while the logistical system moved smoothly on paper, the reality in the field began to reveal complications. Some units used the drug sparingly, reserving it for critical phases. Others distributed it generously, leading to irregular consumption patterns. Certain medics issued the stimulant to entire platoons before long marches, while others favored individuals they believed would benefit most. A few officers, impressed by the drug's effects, began issuing tablets with minimal oversight, turning Pervitin from a controlled stimulant into something closer to a routine ration. Medical officers noticed the consequences almost immediately. Soldiers returned to aid posts, shaking from exhaustion after the drug wore off. Others displayed signs of irritability or emotional flattening that affected discipline. A handful arrived with severe crashes, their bodies pushed so far beyond natural limits that rest became urgently necessary. These cases were documented, but they rarely reached high command. The logistical focus remained on ensuring the next shipment arrived on time. The irony was that Germany, in its obsession with speed, had created a new dependency. Units that used Pervitin during training now expected it for real operations. Officers planning nighttime thrusts included stimulant distribution in their timetables. Panzer crews, accustomed to driving for 2 days without rest, were quietly anxious about performing the same feats without chemical assistance. By spring of 1940, the Wehrmacht had unintentionally become reliant on a drug that it publicly never acknowledged. Pervitin was not listed on official supply manifests sent to Berlin. It was not mentioned in speeches, directives, or public addresses. Yet, it flowed through the arteries of the German army as surely as petrol. Logistics officers understood a truth that few dared to articulate. An army built on speed could not afford to slow down. And Pervitin, the small tablet tucked into field jackets and medic kits, had become part of the engine driving that speed. When German forces launched their offensive into the West on May 10, 1940, the world expected a repeat of the First World War, a grinding clash of trenches, artillery duels, and static fronts. What followed instead was a lightning campaign that shattered France in just 6 weeks. To historians, the victory became synonymous with armoured thrusts, daring manoeuvres through the Ardennes, and the collapse of Allied coordination. But inside the Wehrmacht's medical logs, another element revealed itself quietly. Thousands of soldiers completing operations under chemically extended wakefulness. The breakthrough in the Ardennes was the clearest example. The terrain was rugged, the roads narrow, and the timetable unforgiving. The High Command expected delays, yet demanded speed. Panzer divisions were ordered to push through the forest in continuous waves, bridging rivers, navigating hairpin mountain roads, and seizing crossings before the French could react. Normal infantry would have needed rest cycles, but the units leading the charge consumed Pervitin as they advanced, swallowing tablets before night marches, during river crossings, and in the hours before dawn. The result was astonishing. Some panzer units drove for 36 hours straight, pausing only to refuel. Tank commanders stood half out of their turrets with unblinking eyes, scanning tree lines as if fatigue did not exist. Radio operators maintained rapid, crisp communication, long past the point where exhaustion should have fractured their concentration. Drivers maneuvered heavy vehicles over unstable bridges and through bottleneck traffic with a confidence that unnerved even their own officers. Infantry units supporting the tanks displayed similar stamina. Marches that should have taken 2 days were completed in one. Soldiers scaled slopes, repaired bridges, and engaged in firefights after almost no rest. Reports described unusual alertness, near continuous mobility, and elevated morale during extended operations. What few of these official summaries mentioned was the stimulant enabling that performance. The Luftwaffe's role further expanded the dependence. Pilots flew repeated sorties over Belgium and northern France with minimal breaks between missions. Some remained airborne for so long that ground crews expected them to collapse upon landing, but instead they arrived energized, jittery, and ready for another flight. Flight surgeons noted that pilots who had taken Pervitin showed fewer signs of disorientation during night missions and maintained sharper reaction times during dive bombing runs. But they also recorded something more troubling: a growing pattern of overconfident flying. Combat logs from the early days of the campaign reveal pilots diving lower than necessary, approaching anti-aircraft positions with boldness that bordered on recklessness. A stimulant that heightened focus also dulled caution, but as long as missions succeeded, warnings were treated as footnotes. The consequences of extended stimulant use began to appear during the drive toward the Somme. After several days of continuous movement, some units abruptly collapsed into exhaustion so severe that officers struggled to wake them. Soldiers lay beside roadsides in deep, unhealthy sleep, bodies spent from chemically prolonged effort. Others stumbled through the final hours of an operation with slow, unfocused eyes, the telltale signs of a Pervitin crash. A few experienced tremors or emotional outbursts when the stimulant wore off. But the German advance was moving too quickly for these symptoms to be investigated thoroughly. France fell with stunning speed. Newspapers celebrated the victory. Propaganda films credited German genius, discipline, and the superiority of Blitzkrieg. No mention was made of the tablets that kept men marching through the night, driving tanks until their muscles shook, or flying missions long after natural limits had passed. Within the Wehrmacht's logistical corps, however, the truth was unmistakable. Units that had relied on Pervitin to maintain tempo could not have sustained their performance without it. The stimulant did not win battles on its own, but it fueled the relentless momentum that defined the campaign. Germany interpreted the fall of France as proof that lightning war was unstoppable. Yet beneath the triumph lay a stark reality. The war machine was now tied, quietly and dangerously, to a chemical crutch. Blitzkrieg had worked, but it had been fought, in part, by soldiers who had not slept in days. As German forces surged across Western Europe, commanders increasingly noted an intangible but unmistakable shift in the behavior of soldiers using Pervitin. It wasn't only the physical endurance, the long marches, sleepless nights, or ability to operate machinery with unnatural clarity. What drew the most attention were the psychological effects. Officers began to describe troops who displayed heightened confidence, sharpened focus, and a sense of calm that seemed almost unnatural amid the chaos of battle. This psychological edge, as some quietly called it, became one of the most striking characteristics of the drug-enhanced army. In the days following the Ardennes breakthrough, numerous reports recorded soldiers charging into towns with a fearlessness that startled even hardened veterans. Infantry advancing through Belgian villages often did so with quick, decisive movements, reacting to enemy fire with what appeared to be remarkable composure. Their voices were clipped, their eyes fixed, and their responses almost immediate. Many officers attributed this to training and adrenaline, but medical officers, familiar with the stimulant's effects, recognized something else beneath the surface. Pervitin suppressed doubt. It dulled hesitation. It created a sense of forward-driving determination that aligned perfectly with the doctrine of Blitzkrieg. One company commander later wrote that his men seemed as though they believed nothing could stop them, moving with a momentum that made retreat almost unthinkable. This confidence boosted morale in the earliest stages of combat, encouraging units to press ahead even when exhausted. But it also introduced a new risk: overconfidence. In several engagements along the Meuse, soldiers pushed forward before receiving proper orders, convinced they could overwhelm enemy positions faster than planned. A platoon near Dinant advanced too aggressively into a wooded ridge, misjudging the strength of French defenders. Though they eventually seized the position, their initiative cost unnecessary. Lives something their lieutenant linked directly to a state of unusual boldness observed in the hours before the assault. Tank crews experienced a similar psychological intensification. Pervitin fostered a form of tunnel vision, an unwavering focus on the mission at hand. Inside, claustrophobic interior of a panzer, where confusion often reigned during heated engagements. This clarity was initially beneficial, but it could also turn dangerous. Several after-action reports from armoured divisions described gunners who fired hastily, convinced of their aim, or commanders who pushed their vehicles into narrow choke points, with the belief that momentum alone would carry them through. In some cases, it did. In others, tanks were ambushed, disabled, or isolated. Luftwaffe pilots displayed the psychological edge most dramatically. Pervitin boosted their confidence during dive-bombing runs, allowing them to perform precision attacks with striking calm under fire. But this composed boldness sometimes tipped into unnecessary risk. Doctors noted that stimulant-enhanced pilots occasionally flew lower than recommended or lingered over targets a fraction too long. Decisions that, in the unforgiving world of anti-aircraft fire, could be fatal. Still, within the broader scope of the Western offensive, the drug's psychological effects appeared to serve Germany's goals. Troops were bolder, quicker to exploit openings, and more relentless in maintaining pressure. The Wehrmacht's greatest weapon was tempo, and Pervitin helped sustain the aggressive mindset required to keep that tempo unbroken. Yet beneath the surface, disturbances rippled. A medic with the 10th Panzer Division noted that after extended periods of stimulant use, soldiers exhibited an edginess that bordered on paranoia. Some reacted sharply to sudden noises. Others interpreted minor disagreements as personal slights. A few grew oddly emotional in quiet moments, their confidence evaporating into restlessness as the drug wore off. The High Command, reviewing psychological reports, acknowledged these concerns, but saw them as acceptable collateral in the pursuit of rapid victory. War, in their eyes, demanded cold resolve. If Pervitin helped provide it, then the risks seemed secondary, and so the psychological edge, that potent blend of clarity, boldness, and diminished fear, became another invisible layer of Blitzkrieg. It sharpened Germany's spearhead just enough to break through the fragile defences of Europe. But every edge cuts both ways. The same confidence that tore across France would, in time, meet resistance, fatigue, and the brutal realities of prolonged war realities no stimulant could keep buried forever. While enlisted men had been using Pervitin since the earliest field trials, its presence among the officer corps marked a turning point in the culture of the Wehrmacht. At first, senior leaders viewed the stimulant purely as a tool for frontline endurance, something for soldiers who marched through the night or tank crews who fought through smoke and steel. But as the Western campaign intensified, officers themselves began to feel the strain of continuous operations. They too were exhausted, overworked, and locked inside the unrelenting tempo of Blitzkrieg. The moment Pervitin entered their world, the war changed subtly but significantly. Field officers in charge of coordinating rapid advances often worked 2 or 3 days without meaningful rest. They juggled maps, dispatches, and battlefield updates under constant pressure to maintain tempo. Command posts moved quickly behind the front line, sometimes relocating 3 or 4 times in a single day. Radio traffic filled every hour, and decisions needed to be made instantly, sometimes before full information arrived. It was during these periods of sleepless strain that medics first offered Pervitin to officers as support for extended operational readiness. The phrasing was deliberately careful. No one wanted to admit that commanders were as vulnerable to fatigue as the men they led. But the first officers who accepted the tablets recognized their effects immediately. Reports describe a sharpened sense of clarity during long planning sessions. Majors and colonels responsible for orchestrating complex troop movements found themselves able to focus with unusual intensity. Eyes that had been dull with exhaustion brightened. Speech quickened. The fog of sleeplessness lifted just enough to provide what felt like renewed energy. Officers scribbled orders with sharper confidence and coordinated maneuvers in ways that impressed their own staff. One regimental commander wrote privately that after 2 nights without sleep, a single dose made him feel as if the battlefield snapped into place, allowing him to operate with quiet urgency instead of panic. Another noted that Pervitin allowed him to think through logistics problems with mechanical precision. Officers responsible for bridging operations, artillery placement, or armoured coordination began relying on the stimulant during pivotal moments of the campaign. But as with the enlisted men, the psychological effects carried risks. Some officers became excessively assertive, pushing their units harder than necessary and underestimating the dangers ahead. Reports from the Meuse crossing mentioned several commanders who issued bold, even reckless orders under the influence of stimulants, thrusts that worked brilliantly in some cases and disastrously in others. One major, convinced that his regiment could reach a strategic town before nightfall, drove his men through 14 straight hours of marching. They arrived victorious, but collapsed shortly after, many falling into deep, unhealthy sleep that medics struggled to interrupt. The Luftwaffe experienced its own shift as Pervitin reached squadron leaders. Officers planning missions at night found their alertness unnaturally prolonged. Briefings became increasingly intense, with some commanders issuing orders at a rapid pace that junior officers struggled to absorb. In at least one division, a commander's stimulant-fueled confidence led to an overly ambitious flight plan that pushed pilots to their limits, resulting in needless losses when exhaustion overtook the unit later. The stimulant's effect on hierarchy also became noticeable. Officers on Pervitin sometimes spoke with a speed and sharpness that intimidated subordinates. Their patience shortened, their tempers grew brittle. Some developed a heightened sense of certainty, a conviction that their decisions were correct even when evidence suggested restraint. Military discipline relied on steady judgment and temperance, but judgment under chemical pressure could shift in subtle, dangerous ways. Still, the high command largely embraced the trend. Officers who kept the advance moving were praised. Those who held their lines under pressure were commended. And if Pervitin helped them maintain that performance, few questioned its value. Medics, however, noticed the same pattern forming at the officer level that they had seen among enlisted men. The crash. After the stimulant wore off, some officers became withdrawn or irritable, struggling to think clearly or make decisions. Others experienced physical weakness or brief episodes of trembling. A few descended into emotional exhaustion that took days to recover from. Yet these effects rarely appeared in official logs. Officers were discreet, and the army's culture discouraged admitting vulnerability. As the war pressed forward, Pervitin became part of the unspoken toolkit of leadership. A stimulant that erased fatigue, gave commanders an advantage but also concealed the human. Limits that strategy still relied on. With officers now joining their men in chemically sustained wakefulness, the line between discipline and overconfidence blurred. The army was still winning, but it was increasingly doing so on borrowed stamina, borrowed clarity, and borrowed judgment. And the cost of those loans had not yet come due. As Pervitin usage spread from enlisted men to officers, the Wehrmacht's medical officers found themselves in a precarious position. They were responsible for monitoring the health of an army, now operating on chemically extended wakefulness, yet they were also under quiet pressure to support the momentum that had made Blitzkrieg so effective. Their warnings, though increasingly urgent, were often softened in official reports or redirected into restricted files few were allowed to read. Still, the signs were becoming too obvious to ignore. By the summer of 1940, after the lightning victories in Poland, Belgium, and France, medical stations across the Western Front began recording a spike in unusual symptoms. Soldiers arrived not with wounds, but with tremors, heart palpitations, grinding anxiety, and sudden emotional swings. Some collapsed into deep, almost unnatural sleep after days of stimulant-driven activity. Others arrived confused, disoriented, or convinced that invisible threats lurked in the evening shadows. Medics documented these cases in detail. One infantryman, after marching for nearly 48 hours, reported seeing moving figures along a tree line during a night patrol, figures no one else could confirm. Another soldier in a panzer division experienced a panic episode in the middle of a routine maintenance check, insisting that the engine noise was speaking to him. A Luftwaffe pilot broke down during debriefing, trembling violently as the stimulant wore off, unable to process simple questions without tears. Doctors recognized the symptoms. Acute stimulant after effects, compounded by sleep deprivation. The deeper problem, however, lay in the drug's cumulative impact. Pervitin was not being used sparingly. Some units consumed it repeatedly during extended operations, with dosages far exceeding the cautious recommendations buried in medical directives. Officers, pressed for speed, often encouraged continued use without understanding the neurological toll. Soldiers who had experienced the drug's benefits began requesting it preemptively, not to endure long marches, but simply to keep the edge. This development alarmed medical officers. Dependence was forming. The confidential memos grew sharper. One report noted that repeated use caused psychophysical overstimulation followed by severe exhaustion. Another warned that the lack of proper rest during operations risked long-term deterioration of mental resilience. A third, written by a senior army physician, suggested that stimulant reliance could undermine discipline by amplifying emotional instability. Yet when these concerns reached higher command, they collided with the reality of ongoing war. Germany's stunning victories had created a dangerous confidence. Blitzkrieg seemed unstoppable, and anything that supported its speed was seen as a strategic asset. Medical warnings were acknowledged, but often minimized. Commanders argued that the side effects appeared manageable, and that the drug's benefits far outweighed the risks, especially during the crucial opening phases of offensives. One general dismissed dependence concerns outright, stating, "No, the soldier becomes dependent on victory." Behind the scenes, however, some doctors feared that the army was drifting into chemical reliance without a plan for its consequences. They observed that units running low on Pervitin performed noticeably worse, as if their bodies had forgotten how to function without artificial stimulation. Troops became irritable, lethargic, or emotionally withdrawn when the stimulant was not available. This pattern, though subtle, worried the medical staff deeply. The moral tension grew. Doctors were trained to protect their patients, but in war, especially the kind Germany was fighting, the needs of the army overshadowed the needs of the individual. Medics who raised too many objections risked being seen as obstructive, even disloyal. Some buried their concerns in additional classified files. Others tried to enforce stricter distribution standards within their units. Many simply observed, documented, and hoped the war would end before the consequences became unmanageable. But history rarely spares those who ignore chemical dependencies. The Wehrmacht's medical officers were beginning to see the first cracks in the drug-fueled machine cracks that hinted at future breakdowns the High Command refused to imagine. Despite their warnings, Pervitin continued to flow through the German ranks. The concerns grew louder, the tablets grew more common, and the cost of sustaining an army beyond its natural limits was only beginning to reveal itself. By the time France capitulated in June of 1940, the Wehrmacht stood at what appeared to be the height of its power. Newspapers celebrated the brilliance of German strategy. Propaganda films depicted troops marching tirelessly, tank columns thundering forward without pause, and pilots returning from mission after mission with unwavering precision. To the world and to much of Germany, the victories seemed to confirm the superiority of the Reich's military doctrine. But inside the sealed medical files and quiet conversations of staff officers, a different understanding was forming. Many of these triumphs had been carried on the backs of soldiers who had not slept in days. The rapid advances, the relentless operational tempo, the night assaults and unbroken pursuit all had been sustained, in part, by Pervitin. It was the invisible ingredient in Blitzkrieg. In the weeks following the campaign, senior officers sifted through the after-action reports. They studied timelines of armoured thrusts, charts documenting march speeds, and summaries of unit readiness. Again and again, they saw the same pattern. Units known to have used the stimulant sustained higher levels of performance, moved farther in less time, and maintained cohesion through phases where exhaustion should have slowed them. Even skeptical officers acknowledged the correlation. One Panzer division reported driving nearly 100 kilometers in a single day through difficult terrain, with crews remaining operational almost continuously. Another infantry regiment recorded completing what should have been a 2-day march in 19 hours, maintaining combat readiness afterward. Luftwaffe squadrons flew sorties deep into France long after French defences began crumbling, with pilots displaying sharp reflexes despite obvious sleep deficits. Behind these extraordinary feats lay a logistical fact few were eager to publicise. Tens of thousands of Pervitin tablets had been consumed during the first weeks of the campaign. Quiet internal tallies estimated that more soldiers had used the stimulant than had not. It was not the deciding factor, but it was undeniably a contributing one. And yet, despite its impact, Pervitin did not appear in the official narratives. There were no medals issued for chemically enhanced endurance, no public acknowledgement that the 10UT5, the speed of the offensive, had been, in part, sustained by a drug that turned exhaustion into temporary clarity. The stimulant remained a hidden part of the machinery, a tool whispered about in field posts, not printed in military communiques. At the same time, some officers felt a growing unease. The very successes attributed to the drug revealed a troubling dependency. Units that had used Pervitin most heavily showed the most dramatic collapses afterward. Soldiers slept deeply and uncontrollably for hours, sometimes days, once the fighting slowed. Others experienced emotional volatility or sudden disorientation as their bodies tried to recover from chemically suppressed rest. Even officers felt the crash withdrawing into silence, snapping at subordinates, or struggling to make routine decisions after days of stimulant-enhanced vigilance. Medical officers quietly noted that the STARM, Army stamina during the advance, had been borrowed rather than earned. Borrowed against a debt the body would eventually demand back. Still, the High Command's focus remained solidly on victory. Germany had defeated one of Europe's strongest armies in record time. The Reich now controlled vast territories stretching from the North Sea to the Pyrenees. In this moment of triumph, few had the appetite to question the foundation of that speed. Instead, planners looked to the future. Operations against Britain were being prepared. New offensives in the Balkans and North Africa were unfolding. And beyond them, in quiet strategic circles, discussions had already begun about the East. The coming campaign against the Soviet Union would dwarf everything fought so far in distance, in scale, in brutality. If Pervitin had helped soldiers push through 36 or 72 hours of continuous operations in France, then what role might it play in a campaign spanning thousands of kilometers over months? The stimulant had proven itself in victory. Now, without fully realizing it, the Wehrmacht was preparing to rely on it even more. Germany believed its armies had become unstoppable, but many of those victories had been won by men whose minds were sharpened and whose limits were erased by a tablet no one wanted to admit was becoming essential. As the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into Europe and the use of Pervitin became increasingly normalized, medical officers began documenting a phase of the stimulant's effect that was both impressive and alarming. The period of heightened exhilaration that soldiers themselves called the surge. It was more than wakefulness. It was a kind of sharpened, driving euphoria, a sensation that made men feel stronger, faster, and more capable than fatigue or fear would normally allow. This phase, fleeting but intense, often appeared within an hour of taking the drug. Infantrymen described it first. After long marches through cold nights or exhausting river crossings, a tablet could lift their spirits with startling speed. Soldiers who moments earlier dragged their boots through mud suddenly moved with renewed purpose. Their posture straightened, their voices grew louder. Conversations returned where silence had settled. One medic recorded a soldier saying, "It felt like the darkness backed away from me." Another noted a private who marched at the front of his platoon singing something unheard of after 30 hours without rest. This euphoria carried over into combat. Readiness. Units preparing for assaults often reported a collective sense of confidence that bordered on exhilaration. One lieutenant wrote that his men seemed invincible for a short time, pushing forward with an aggression that startled even him. He saw soldiers charge obstacles with an enthusiasm that defied their physical condition. Men who should have collapsed, acting as if they were beginning a fresh operation. The effect inside armoured units was even more pronounced. Panzer crews, who normally operated in a tight, stressful environment, described a surge of clarity and excitement shortly after taking the drug. Drivers felt unusually attuned to the terrain, interpreting bumps and vibrations as if they were extensions of their own senses. Gunners spoke of a strange ease in target acquisition, as though the barrel moved before I told it to, one said. Tank commanders, half emerging from their turrets under the roar of engines and gunfire, reported a heightened sense of control over chaotic battlefields. But with the euphoria came risk. Medical officers noticed early on that this phase sometimes tipped soldiers toward impulsive or overly bold actions. During one engagement near the French-Belgian border, a squad under stimulant influence advanced too quickly, overestimating its ability to suppress enemy fire. They succeeded in reaching their objective, but only after sustaining unnecessary casualties. Their sergeant later admitted the truth. "We felt too good, too strong, too sure." Similar patterns emerged in panzer units. Crews operating under the euphoria phase occasionally pushed forward without waiting for supporting infantry. In one report, a tank platoon surged into a town ahead of schedule, forcing the rest of the battalion to adjust hastily. The after-action review quietly noted the stimulant's role in the decision. The Luftwaffe, too, felt the euphoria's allure. Pilots preparing for dangerous missions sometimes exhibited heightened excitement before takeoff, a sense of eager confidence that concerned flight surgeons. Once airborne, the stimulant sharpened their reflexes, but it also made them more prone to taking risks. Some flew lower than recommended or held their attack dives a second too long, trusting their reaction times more than they should have. What unsettled medical staff was not the euphoria itself, but its unpredictability. The stimulant amplified emotional tendencies, aggression in some, exuberance in others, restlessness or agitation in others still. Commanders could not predict how a unit would react under the surge, making discipline inconsistent during high stress. operations. And then, inevitably, came the crash. After the euphoria passed, soldiers often spiraled into exhaustion, irritability, or emotional volatility. A private who had been laughing during a night march might be trembling the next morning. A tank commander who had felt in total control might struggle to issue simple orders with calm. Pilots who had flown with razor-sharp focus sometimes returned unsteady, unable to stand without assistance. The army benefited from the highs but quietly bore the burden of the lows. By the end of the Western campaign, the euphoria phase had become an unspoken feature of Blitzkrieg, a momentary illusion of strength that propelled units past their natural limits. It helped Germany achieve victories with breathtaking speed, but the stimulant psychological surge was not free. It borrowed courage from tomorrow. It delayed exhaustion only to unleash it later with even greater force. And as the Wehrmacht prepared for future campaigns, that debt hidden behind triumph was growing. As the Wehrmacht's campaigns expanded across Europe, a troubling pattern began to surface in the reports reaching medical officers and mid-level commanders. The stimulant that had powered the long marches and breakneck offensives was not only sharpening alertness, it was eroding caution. What began as isolated incidents soon formed a recognizable behavioral profile among soldiers who used Pervitin regularly. Heightened aggression, impulsive decision-making, and a willingness to take risks far beyond the boundaries of discipline. It became known quietly among officers as the recklessness problem. The earliest signs emerged among infantry units during the latter stages of the French campaign. Platoon leaders noticed that certain soldiers became unnervingly eager during firefights, pushing ahead without waiting for covering fire or turning down alleys without reconnaissance. 1. Their lieutenant described a private who sprinted across an open field under machine gun fire, as if danger had lost its meaning to him. The soldier survived only because the French gunners failed to track him in time. In the after-action report, the officer noted the young man's unnatural boldness and linked it to Pervitin taken shortly beforehand. In urban fighting, the stimulant's effects were even more apparent. Assault teams clearing buildings in Lille and Reims sometimes moved too fast, bursting into rooms before grenades detonated or before their comrades had secured rear exits. The drug created a false sense of clarity, a belief that reactions were sharper and judgment keener than they truly were. Soldiers believed they could not be surprised, a dangerous illusion in city combat, where every doorway and staircase carried lethal risk. Panzer crews exhibited their own form of stimulant-driven recklessness. Tanks are meant to operate with coordination, advancing with infantry support, maintaining spacing, and avoiding narrow positions where ambushes thrive. But several reports from armoured divisions told a different story. Drivers under the influence pushed their vehicles into choke points without waiting for reconnaissance. Gunners fired too quickly, convinced their reflexes were infallible. One panzer platoon near Abbeville advanced an entire kilometre ahead of its regiment after its commander, energised by Pervitin, insisted they could break the French line alone. They succeeded in the moment only to find themselves nearly encircled when the rest of the division struggled to catch up. The Luftwaffe faced similar challenges. Pilots, especially younger ones, became more daring in attack runs, diving lower or staying, exposed over targets longer than tactical doctrine advised. Flight surgeons documented increased overconfidence during briefings, a kind of chemically fueled assurance that their skill could outpace danger. In the clear skies above France, this sometimes worked, but in the clouded, flak-ridden skies over Britain, such recklessness would prove far more costly. Medical officers recognized the danger early. They observed that Pervitin did not merely erase fatigue, it muted internal restraints. The quiet voice of caution that kept soldiers alive on the battlefield grew faint. One physician described it as a chemical silencing of fear. Another warned in a confidential memo that the drug induced operational bravado, unconnected to tactical reality. Yet these warnings reached a wall of pragmatism. Commanders, buoyed by victory, saw the stimulant's benefits more clearly than its risks. After all, Many of the risky actions taken by stimulant-enhanced soldiers had succeeded during the rapid advance through France. Their boldness had helped exploit breakthroughs before the Allies could reorganize. Their fearlessness had shattered defensive lines at key moments. Recklessness was dangerous, but in Blitzkrieg, the line between daring and victory was razor-thin. Still, some officers privately feared what would happen when circumstances changed. The Western campaign was fast, fluid, and comparatively short, but the next war, the one already, under quiet planning in Berlin, would be different. It would involve distances far greater than France, supply lines far more fragile, and enemies far more resilient. Recklessness had served Germany, while victory came quickly, but in a prolonged conflict across open plains, harsh winters, and endless horizons, it could become a liability too costly to ignore. The stimulant had made soldiers bold. Soon, it would make them vulnerable. In the glow of Germany's rapid victories, the High Command saw only momentum divisions racing across maps, cities falling in days, and commanders reporting progress at a pace unmatched in modern warfare. But when the dust settled after each major push, a different set of reports filtered quietly into medical stations, field hospitals, and regimental aid posts. These were not reports of wounds, but of collapse, not from enemy fire, but from the body's exhausted plea for rest. Physicians began calling them the quiet crashes, sudden, uncontrollable breakdowns that struck soldiers after the effects of Pervitin wore off. The crashes came without warning. A soldier who had marched 30 or 40 hours straight, speaking rapidly and moving with almost mechanical purpose, would suddenly become pale, unfocused, and lethargic. His steps slowed, his eyes dulled. Sometimes he trembled without understanding why. The stimulant had allowed him to push his body far beyond natural limits, but once the chemical clarity evaporated, the debt came due. In the days after the campaign in France, medical tents filled with men who had simply fallen asleep where they stood, or slumped into roadside ditches, their bodies shutting down entirely. Medics found soldiers collapsed beside artillery pieces they had just helped fire, half asleep as they tried to reload shells. Others dozed uncontrollably inside foxholes or leaned against tree trunks, unresponsive even when shaken. Their exhaustion was not ordinary fatigue, it was a deep, bone-level shutdown that sleep alone could not immediately cure. Infantry officers grew concerned. A sergeant reported 3 of his men falling asleep mid-sentence during a post-battle debriefing, their heads dropping forward as if yanked by gravity. A lieutenant watched a radio operator drift into unconsciousness in the middle of transmitting coordinates, leaving the line open while he breathed heavily into the receiver. In another case, a soldier fell asleep during guard duty and had to be relieved before he put his entire platoon at risk. Panzer crews experienced similar collapses. After days of stimulant-driven operations, tank commanders found their men slumped inside their vehicles, helmets sliding off, hands shaking uncontrollably. Some had difficulty coordinating basic movements. Others suffered disorientation, so profound that medics initially suspected neurological injury. Instead, the diagnosis was almost always the same: extreme exhaustion following stimulant withdrawal. Luftwaffe personnel suffered crashes of their own, usually after long missions. Pilots who had flown with razor-sharp focus during combat now stumbled across airfields as if intoxicated. Ground crews described aviators sitting silently beside their aircraft, staring into nothing, unable to speak coherently. Flight surgeons noted that several pilots had to be grounded for days, their nervous systems too, overstimulated to allow safe operation of machinery. Medical officers struggled to manage these crashes. There were no established protocols for dealing with stimulant withdrawal in a military setting. The solution, when possible, was simple: rest. But rest was a luxury the German army often could not afford. Units still needed to advance, occupy territory, repair vehicles, and prepare for the next move. Soldiers experiencing crashes were sometimes forced back into duty before they had fully recovered, compounding the effects. At staff meetings, medical officers tried to raise the issue. They noted that stimulant-induced wakefulness came at the cost of deeper exhaustion afterward. They insisted that long-term reliance on Pervitin could weaken a soldier's resilience rather than strengthen it. Their warnings were received politely, recorded in transcripts, and then overshadowed by operational demands. The commanders saw only results. The stimulant worked until it didn't, and that was the flaw. The quiet crashes revealed the limits of chemically sustained warfare. They signaled that the Wehrmacht's celebrated endurance was not a constant, but a spike, a dangerous high followed by an equally dangerous low. But in the flush of victory, few wanted to dwell on the downward slope. The stimulant had driven the army through France. Now, in the aftermath, the soldiers' bodies were claiming the hours they had been denied. The crashes were a whisper beneath the thunder of triumph, a warning echoing through medical tents that the war Germany was preparing to fight next would demand far more than a tablet could ever give. Long before medical officers compiled statistics or commanders debated the merits of stimulants, the first honest accounts of Pervitin's effects appeared not in reports, but in letters home. These handwritten notes, sent from bunkers, barns, and makeshift camps along the front lines, revealed a side of the war that official documents rarely acknowledged. They captured the human cost behind the German army's extraordinary endurance, written in the unguarded voice of soldiers who were trying to understand what was happening to their own minds and bodies. At first, the letters reflected excitement. "My thoughts feel clear," one young infantryman wrote to his sister during the first weeks of the Western campaign. "I haven't slept in 2 nights, but I don't feel tired at all. It's like there's a small fire inside that keeps me marching." The lieutenant says, "We'll reach the river by dawn. I think we can do it." Another soldier described the energy Pervitin gave him. "We walk and the hours disappear. My legs don't feel heavy. I feel awake, almost too awake. It's like my eyes can see farther than usual." But as the stimulant spread through the ranks and the initial victories gave way to longer operations, the tone of these letters began to change. A panzer crewman wrote, "I feel sharp when the tablets are in me, but afterward I crash like a stone. Yesterday I fell asleep against the tank while cleaning the gun." The others laughed, but I don't think they understand how strange it feels, like my body belongs to someone else. A corporal in the infantry described inner turmoil. "The medicine makes me brave, maybe too brave. I charged ahead without thinking yesterday. When the fighting stopped, I realized how close I came to getting myself killed. I don't know why I did it. It felt right at the time. Now, I can't stop shaking." By the summer of 1940, more letters spoke of confusion and fear than exhilaration. "My heart races after I take the pills. Then it slows, like it's struggling to remember how to beat normally. Sometimes I feel like I'm floating above myself, watching my own hands move." Another soldier confessed, "The nights are the worst. When the effects wear off, the world feels heavy and dark. I can't stop thinking. I can't sleep even when I'm tired. My thoughts run in circles. I don't tell the sergeant. I don't want him to know." Some letters mentioned hallucinations, always described quietly, always with uncertainty. "I thought I saw figures moving between the trees during patrol," wrote a private along the Meuse. "No, one else saw them. Maybe I was too tired. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks. Or maybe it was the tablets. I don't know anymore." Others described an emotional numbness. "It's like the drug steals something. You don't feel fear, but you also don't feel much of anything. The laughter in the camp sounds far away. I miss home, but the feeling is flat, as if someone covered it with a blanket." Many soldiers tried to reassure their families and themselves. "These pills help us win," one wrote. "They make us fast, make us strong. The officers say it's necessary. I want to believe them." Yet even in these attempts at optimism, a quiet unease surfaced. The men recognized the change within themselves, even if they didn't understand its cause. For historians, these letters would become some of the earliest evidence of the psychological grip Pervitin held over the Prester. German soldier, Not the official language of stimulant effectiveness or extended wakefulness, but the personal truth, the exhilaration, the confusion, the dependence, the fear of losing control. No report captured it better than a short letter found years after the war, written by a 19-year-old infantryman near the Channel coast. I don't feel like myself anymore. The war moves fast, and we move with it, faster than men should. The tablets keep us going, but sometimes I wonder what part of me is left when they wear off. The letters revealed what the High Command refused to admit. Victory had come at a cost, measured not in casualties, but in the minds and bodies of the men who carried the weight of Blitzkrieg forward. And the war, the real war, had only just begun. As German units pushed through the forests of northern France during the spring campaign of 1940, field reports began to note a disquieting phenomenon: soldiers experiencing visual disturbances and hallucinations. Initially dismissed as fatigue, these incidents became increasingly frequent and were closely correlated with stimulant use. Medics and unit officers recorded cases in quiet logs, aware that admitting such occurrences publicly could undermine morale and raise uncomfortable questions about the Army's reliance on chemical enhancement. The first notable incidents occurred during night marches through the Ardennes and Meuse forests. Infantry units, already strained from continuous movement and combat operations, were being supplied with Pervitin to maintain alertness. Soldiers marched through dense undergrowth, with their vision sharpened by artificial stimulation. But in some cases, heightened perception merged with exhaustion, creating illusions that blurred reality. One private reported seeing a phantom enemy patrol moving in the trees, only to realize, after several tense minutes, that the shadows were cast by swaying branches. Another soldier described flickering lights in the distance, interpreting them as advancing tanks, when in fact it was the reflection of moonlight on wet leaves. These hallucinations were brief but intense, enough to cause confusion or hesitation in units already operating on tight margins of timing and coordination. Tank crews also experienced similar effects, albeit in a confined, metallic environment. Driving through narrow forest paths, some reported that tree trunks appeared to shift position, or that the path ahead seemed to lengthen unnaturally. Gunners sometimes misidentified harmless obstacles as threats, firing prematurely at imaginary targets. Though these incidents rarely led to significant operational errors, medics noted the potential for disaster if the stimulant-induced illusions coincided with real combat. Pilots flying low-level reconnaissance missions over forested areas encountered another variation. The stimulant heightened visual acuity and reflexes, but prolonged exposure, without rest, produced optical distortions. Some reported seeing movement along ridges where there was none. Others described sudden flashes of color, interpreted as anti-aircraft fire or enemy positions. Flight surgeons quietly documented these episodes, concerned that overconfidence combined with visual misperception could result in crashes or unnecessary engagements. Medical officers began to formalize these observations. Confidential memos categorized the hallucinations as consequence of prolonged stimulant use combined with extended wakefulness. The drug amplified sensory input while suppressing fatigue signals, creating a state where perception became unreliable. Some soldiers experienced fleeting auditory hallucinations as well, hearing voices or mechanical sounds that were not present. These symptoms were recorded as part of a growing dossier on the psychological impact of Pervitin, which noted that even disciplined units could be affected if the stimulant was overused. The hallucinations highlighted a paradox. The drug allowed soldiers to operate at levels that exceeded natural human limits, but at the same time it introduced subtle but potentially dangerous distortions in perception and judgment. Commanders generally tolerated these anomalies because the overall operational advantage remained significant. Blitzkrieg relied on relentless forward motion, and the hallucinations, though alarming, rarely prevented mission completion. Yet medics and officers knew the risk was cumulative. Units that relied heavily on the stimulant and especially those operating in complex terrain like forests, faced a fine line between enhanced performance, impaired decision-making. The forests of France became, in effect, a laboratory for this new form of chemically assisted warfare, a place where victory and vulnerability coexisted in a delicate balance. The hallucinations, though quiet, were an early signal that the human mind, even under the influence of stimulants, had limits that could not be erased. Germany's armies were moving faster and further than ever before, but the forest whispered a warning. Nature, fatigue, and perception would always have their claim. As the Wehrmacht pressed into Belgium and France, and later prepared for the looming campaign in the Low Countries, an insidious problem began to take root among the troops: dependence on Pervitin. Initially embraced as a tool to sustain alertness, confidence, and endurance, the stimulant had gradually become more than a tactical aid. For many soldiers, it evolved into a psychological and physiological necessity, a chemical anchor that they believed they could not operate without. Field medics first noticed the pattern in training camps and forward positions. Soldiers who had experienced Pervitin-enhanced operations insisted on taking tablets before marches, drills, or even short periods of guard duty. Some refused to perform tasks without it. One corporal quietly remarked that his men didn't march right without the stimulant. Officers noticed a subtle but unmistakable change in behavior. Troops became anxious when the tablets were unavailable, fidgeting, complaining of fatigue that normally would have been tolerable, and demanding access to the stimulant at the earliest opportunity. Dependence intensified under the pressure of combat. In the French campaign, where speed and momentum were everything, soldiers faced days of continuous movement. Some units received more Pervitin than planned, encouraged by officers to push further, march faster, and fight longer. Soldiers who might have naturally paused for rest continued marching through forests, towns, and muddy fields with tablets in their pockets. The chemical's effects created the illusion of boundless energy, but the human body was quietly accruing debt. The desperation became most visible during periods of shortage. When supply lines faltered, a crate delayed, a shipment misrouted, soldiers displayed acute anxiety. Some shook uncontrollably, unable to sleep despite exhaustion. Others complained of palpitations, headaches, or a gnawing irritability. In one case, a private, stationed near the Meuse, reportedly began raiding medics' supplies without orders, his desperation palpable. Medics quietly logged the incident, noting it as chemical dependency under operational stress. Officers recognized the operational risk. Dependence meant that a soldier's performance was no longer fully under natural control. If a unit ran out of Pervitin during a critical operation, fatigue and psychological instability could compromise mission success. In some divisions, officers instituted rationing, limiting daily intake to preserve both effectiveness and supply. But rationing often met resistance. Soldiers who had grown accustomed to sustained alertness were unwilling to accept reductions, viewing them as a threat to survival. Medical officers also grew concerned about long-term consequences. Repeated use of methamphetamine was known to produce agitation, hallucinations, and impaired judgment once the stimulant wore off. Combined with extreme sleep deprivation and battlefield stress, these effects were magnified. Memos warned that soldiers could experience permanent psychological disturbances if dependence was prolonged, yet the urgency of ongoing operations muted these warnings in the chain of command. Despite these risks, the high command largely ignored the warning signs. The strategic advantage of an army that could operate continuously far outweighed individual health concerns. Dependence, in this context, became an unspoken operational expectation. Soldiers were pushed chemically, psychologically, and physically beyond limits that would have been considered reasonable before the war. By the summer of 1940, dependence on Pervitin had become endemic. It was no longer merely a tool of endurance. It was a lifeline, one that promised sustained strength, focus, and confidence. while hiding the accumulating cost to body and mind. Germany's armies had gained a new capability, relentless energy at any hour. But with every tablet, the soldiers' reliance grew a quiet, invisible chain that bound them to a chemical necessity they could not abandon, even as the war's demands continued to escalate. By the end of the French campaign, the initial euphoria and performance gains of Pervitin were beginning to reveal a harsher reality: diminishing returns. Soldiers who had once felt unstoppable under the stimulant's influence began to notice that the tablets no longer provided the same surge of energy or clarity. What had initially seemed like an inexhaustible boost now required increasingly larger doses to achieve the same effect. Commanders and medical officers, initially impressed by extended alertness and confidence, were confronted with the first signs of a problem that would grow as Germany prepared for longer campaigns in the East. Field medics began documenting changes systematically. Soldiers who had relied on Pervitin during rapid marches and prolonged operations reported feeling less potent effects after repeated use. One infantryman wrote in a confidential diary, "The first pill made me feel awake, ready, invincible. The second day it helped, but not as much. By the third, I needed 2 just to feel normal." Letters from other soldiers echoed this sentiment. The stimulant no longer erased fatigue, it merely masked it temporarily, and the mask was wearing thinner with every use. The effect was both psychological and physiological. Chemically, the body adapted. Receptor sensitivity in the central nervous system diminished, and tolerance grew. Soldiers who had taken the standard dose during training now found it insufficient in combat conditions. The stimulant's reliability, once considered a strategic asset, became inconsistent. Medics noted that even small increases in dosage carried escalating risks: tremors, palpitations, irritability, and episodes of disorientation. Commanders began to recognize a subtle shift in operational performance. Infantry units that had relied heavily on Pervitin during the advance through France occasionally lagged during extended marches. Panzer crews, accustomed to near-continuous operation, showed moments of miscommunication or delayed reaction. Luftwaffe pilots flying repeated sorties under the stimulant reported heightened anxiety, as though the drug's energy now came with a mental friction that was absent in earlier missions. In training, these signs might have been dismissed, but in combat, even minor delays or errors could carry lethal consequences. The diminishing return was compounded by logistical pressure. Supply lines had to deliver increasing quantities of the stimulant to maintain performance levels. Units that received insufficient Pervitin became noticeably less effective, while those with excess faced the risk of overdose or pronounced crashes. Commanders were forced into careful rationing, yet they were under constant pressure to sustain the operational tempo dictated by Blitzkrieg. The chemical advantage that had once seemed limitless now demanded precise management. Medical officers attempted to raise warnings about these emerging limitations, emphasizing that repeated use would erode both physical and psychological resilience. They documented the early signs of dependence, overstimulation, and diminished responsiveness. Yet, within the broader operational context, these cautions were subordinated to immediate tactical needs. Success in the field, the rapid advance, the unbroken momentum outweighed the long-term consequences for soldiers' health. The diminishing return revealed the delicate balance Germany had struck with its chemical advantage. Pervitin had fueled extraordinary feats, allowing the Wehrmacht to operate at speeds and intensities beyond normal human capacity. Yet the very success of these operations depended on continued supply and careful management. The more the stimulant was relied upon, the more it became a double-edged sword, an enabler of rapid victory and a source of latent vulnerability. By the summer of 1940, it was clear Pervitin was no longer an infallible boost. It was a tool with limits, a chemical that could be stretched only so far before the body demanded repayment. And as Germany looked eastward toward the vastness of the Soviet Union, the question hung over. Commanders, quietly but ominously, how long could an army fight beyond its natural limits before the cost became unbearable? By the time German forces consolidated their advances in France, reports began surfacing from field units that Pervitin was doing more than enhancing alertness and stamina. In some cases, it appeared to be altering the soldiers' behavior in subtle but alarming ways. Beyond the tactical gains, medics and officers noted an increase in incidents of impulsive aggression, acts of violence that exceeded the directives given, sometimes diverging from orders entirely. The stimulant, it seemed, had unleashed not only energy, but a compulsion toward risk and dominance. Infantry units on extended night marches were the first to reveal this pattern. Soldiers who had taken Pervitin to maintain alertness were moving faster, reacting quicker, and displaying heightened intensity during engagements. In several documented skirmishes along the Meuse and Sambre rivers, soldiers advanced, without explicit orders, firing into positions that were supposed to be contained, taking prisoners before security perimeters were fully established, and pursuing retreating enemy forces into potentially dangerous territory. In one report, a company moved ahead of the main battalion, achieving its objective, but simultaneously exposing itself to counterattack, an outcome that could have been disastrous if the enemy had reacted differently. Tank crews showed a similar pattern. The stimulant amplified their focus, but also dulled caution. Reports described panzer crews firing earlier than coordinated orders prescribed, sometimes preempting supporting infantry or advancing into choke points without reconnaissance. The speed and decisiveness produced impressive short-term results, yet they created vulnerabilities that commanders had to anticipate. In multiple cases, medics observed, that overzealous crews took risks unnecessary for the mission, but justified internally by the stimulant-induced confidence that everything would succeed. Luftwaffe pilots experienced these effects most dramatically. The stimulant gave them an edge during extended sorties, but it also encouraged behavior that exceeded protocol. Pilots conducted lower dives, lingered longer over targets, and sometimes disobeyed cautious flight plans, convinced of their enhanced reflexes and perception. Flight surgeons noted the paradox. Precision increased alongside recklessness, producing operational successes, but also increasing exposure to flak and enemy fire. Several minor crashes were attributed directly to misjudgment, influenced by stimulant-driven overconfidence. Medical officers began filing confidential assessments, noting that Pervitin altered judgment in ways difficult to quantify. Soldiers' perception of risk shifted. Actions previously restrained by fatigue or prudence became impulsive. The drug heightened aggression, sharpened focus, and reinforced confidence, simultaneously creating behavior that was highly effective in some tactical situations, but potentially catastrophic in others. They warned quietly that reliance on stimulants could erode discipline, turning coordinated maneuvers into fragmented bursts of unrestrained action. The High Command, aware of these reports, largely discounted them as acceptable collateral. Blitzkrieg depended on speed and audacity. The drug-fueled aggression often produced exactly the outcome planners sought. Successes, after all, were immediate and measurable. Failures, subtle or delayed, were considered manageable. The calculus of victory outweighed concerns for behavioral side effects, particularly in a war conducted at a tempo that exceeded natural endurance. Yet in the quiet of the medical offices, the warning signs were clear. Pervitin's chemical enhancement of aggression and initiative was unpredictable. What drove the army forward might also drive it into unnecessary danger. Soldiers could succeed spectacularly, or they could overreach. Discipline, once a reliable metric, now competed with chemical compulsion. The stimulant had granted Germany extraordinary mobility, speed, and lethality, but it had also loosened the very chains of order that held the machine together. And in the vast theatres still ahead, the forests, rivers, and plains of Europe, yet to be conquered, The consequences of that loosened control were only beginning to be understood. As the Pervitin-fueled advances continued across Western Europe, medics and military physicians began recording a new and alarming phenomenon: full medical breakdowns directly linked to the stimulant's prolonged use. What had started as mild tremors, palpitations, and sleeplessness among individual soldiers escalated into serious physiological and psychological episodes. These breakdowns were not uniform. They varied in severity, duration, and presentation, but their emergence signaled that the chemical support sustaining Blitzkrieg came with a hidden cost few in the high. Command were willing to confront. The infantry experienced the first widespread symptoms. Soldiers who had consumed Pervitin during continuous operations began presenting in field hospitals with acute exhaustion, delirium, and severe muscle tremors. One regiment stationed near Sedan reported that multiple men collapsed during routine inspections, unable to stand without assistance. Medics noted that their pupils were dilated, their pulse rates erratic, and their speech fragmented. In several cases, soldiers exhibited signs of psychosis, paranoia, hallucinations, and disorganized thought. What had begun as a chemical aid to sustain performance had, in some, become a trigger for acute medical crises. Tank crews experienced a parallel set of breakdowns, intensified by the confined and stressful environment of armored vehicles. Soldiers spending extended periods in cramped compartments, exposed to engine heat and vibration, reported severe tremors and dizziness once the stimulant began to wear off. Gunners and drivers occasionally experienced temporary loss of coordination, requiring medics to intervene to prevent accidents during maneuvers. Commanders noted that crews who had performed flawlessly under the influence of Pervitin became incapable of even basic tasks after the drug's effects faded, requiring rotations and recovery periods that disrupted operational tempo. The Luftwaffe faced similarly troubling patterns. Pilots who had flown long missions with chemically enhanced alertness sometimes returned from sorties in a state of acute physiological and psychological stress. Flight surgeons documented tremors, vertigo, blurred vision, and, in several instances, near-fainting episodes upon landing. Cognitive functions were impaired. Pilots misreported instrument readings, forgot mission details, or became disoriented on airfields. Medical officers concluded that stimulant-induced overstimulation, combined with extended wakefulness, created a fragile state in which high-stress environments could trigger breakdowns. Psychological consequences were equally severe. Soldiers who had been under prolonged chemical stimulation often exhibited emotional instability, sudden bursts of anger, irrational fear, and difficulty following orders. One field medic reported that a soldier had repeatedly attempted to assault an officer in the midst of a Pervitin withdrawal episode. While most incidents were less extreme, they illustrated the drug's potential to erode the judgment and discipline essential to unit cohesion. Despite these warnings, the High Command largely ignored the medical breakdowns in operational planning. The rapid victories and strategic mobility achieved by stimulant-enhanced soldiers created an overwhelming bias. Short-term gains overshadowed long-term human costs. Medics continued to log symptoms, recommend rotation schedules, and urge moderation in distribution, but the pressures of Blitzkrieg left a little room for compliance. The army was moving too fast to pause for recovery. The emergence of medical breakdowns was a stark reminder that the human body could only tolerate chemical enhancement for so long. Fatigue, suppressed for days, returned with a vengeance. Pervitin had enabled incredible feats, but it had also exposed soldiers to vulnerabilities that were invisible on maps and unacknowledged in after-action reports. Germany had discovered a force multiplier in Pervitin, one that extended human performance beyond natural limits. But the cost was mounting, quietly and relentlessly, in field hospitals across the Western Front, and as the Wehrmacht prepared to face the vast expanses of the East, medical officers understood that the chemical crutch that had carried the army so far might not hold under the even greater demands to come. By the summer of 1940, after the rapid collapse of France, the soldiers of the Wehrmacht carried more than rifles, maps, and rations into each new campaign. They carried a chemical companion, Pervitin. It had become a silent partner in every march, every assault, every night spent alert, while the world slept. For those men, the war was no longer solely a struggle against enemy forces. It was a war inside their own bodies, a battle between natural human limits and chemically induced endurance. The effects of prolonged stimulant use were cumulative, and not always predictable. Soldiers wrote in diaries, whispered in tents, and sometimes admitted to medics that their bodies no longer responded naturally. They could march for days, fire weapons for hours on end, and maintain vigilance when exhaustion would have felled any ordinary man. Yet beneath this manufactured energy, physiological strain mounted. Tremors, palpitations, and muscle rigidity became commonplace. Soldiers described feeling simultaneously light and heavy, as though their limbs carried a weight no one could measure, even as their minds raced. Psychological effects were equally pervasive. Pervitin, heightened confidence, sometimes to the point of overconfidence. Soldiers who had been hesitant before now advanced without hesitation, often beyond orders, their judgment sharpened yet dangerously detached. Letters from the front revealed a duality. One moment, exhilaration and focus. The next, irritability, paranoia, or emotional emptiness. Men began questioning the reality of their own perceptions, unsure whether their courage was genuine or chemically induced. In diaries, some admitted a quiet fear that the stimulant had changed them in ways they could not reverse. Nighttime offered a little relief. While the stimulant delayed sleep, it did not eliminate the body's need for rest. Soldiers found themselves awake for cycles far longer than the human body could normally sustain, only to collapse in exhaustion when the drug's effects faded. In these moments, some described the sense of unreality, the battlefield blurred with dreams, the sounds of artillery mixed with imagined voices, and fatigue pressed on the mind, with a weight heavier than physical strain. Field medics recorded cases of soldiers who awoke from a few hours of forced rest, trembling, disoriented, and emotionally volatile. The impact extended beyond the individual. Units operating under stimulant influence displayed moments of near-perfect efficiency interspersed with lapses of judgment. Soldiers could perform feats of endurance, but unpredictably so. One unit might advance flawlessly for 48 hours. The next, minor mistakes, misfires, miscommunications, or premature assaults could arise when the stimulant's effect waned. Commanders began recognizing that the war inside the soldier, the chemical, physiological, and psychological struggle, was as critical as the war outside. Medical officers documented these dualities meticulously. They observed how stimulant-induced confidence could turn into overreach, how enhanced focus could lead to fixation on trivial details, and how physical energy could mask mounting psychological strain. The silent cost was accumulating, invisible to those measuring only speed, distance, or battlefield objectives. By the time the army paused to consolidate gains in France, one fact had become clear. Pervitin had reshaped warfare from the inside out. Soldiers were no longer merely instruments of strategy. They were biological machines pushed beyond natural limits. Their victories, impressive as they were, came with a quiet toll. A war fought not only against the enemy, but within themselves. The war inside the soldier had only begun. And as Germany looked eastward toward the vastness of the Soviet Union, the limits of human endurance, even chemically extended, would be tested like never before. By the spring of 1941, the Wehrmacht's gaze had turned eastward. Beyond the forests and rivers of France lay the vastness of the Soviet Union, a landscape of endless plains, frozen rivers, and dense forests stretching farther than any German soldier had ever marched. Unlike the Beatian, compact, rapidly conquered territories of Western Europe, the East promised not swift victories, but grueling campaigns that would test men, machines, and nerves in unprecedented ways. In this theatre, Pervitin would be pushed beyond anything experienced before. Logistics officers calculated distances in hundreds of kilometers, accounting for supply convoys, fuel, and rations. But soldiers and commanders were acutely aware of another variable: human endurance. Marches that had seemed long in France now became punishing odysseys across barren fields and muddy roads. Armies that had relied on the stimulant to maintain speed and alertness were now stretching its effectiveness across weeks of continuous movement, often in harsh conditions. Temperatures ranged from suffocating heat in the south to the biting early frost of the northern steppes. Soldiers carried full packs, heavy weaponry, and the invisible burden of chemical dependence. In infantry units, Pervitin was issued routinely. Medics observed that soldiers could sustain remarkable distances day after day, covering what would have been impossible under natural conditions. Reports noted battalions advancing through Russian forests, covering 20 to 30 kilometers per day with minimal rest. The stimulant masked fatigue, suppressed the sensation of hunger, and dulled the body's natural signals for recovery. Letters from the front described soldiers walking on air during the initial hours, only to collapse for hours in makeshift camps once the drug wore off. Panzer crews faced similar strains. The open plains allowed tanks to maneuver rapidly, but the distances were punishing. Crews operated long hours, often in temperatures fluctuating between freezing mornings and sweltering afternoons. Pervitin maintained alertness, but the physical toll became evident. Exhaustion that had once appeared gradually now struck with sudden intensity once doses wore off. Crews recorded tremors, coordination lapses, and brief lapses in judgment during critical maneuvers. Yet the pressing operational schedule demanded they continue. The Luftwaffe's reconnaissance and bomber units confronted the same challenge. Long sorties over the vast, sparsely populated territory required sustained concentration. Pilots, sometimes airborne for 10 or 12 hours at a time, depended on the stimulant to maintain clarity during navigation, bombing runs, and return flights. Flight surgeons recorded cases of severe overstimulation, where pilots reported both euphoria and anxiety in rapid succession. Some became overconfident, taking risks they would not have attempted in previous campaigns. Medical officers began to recognize a troubling trend. The extended use of Pervitin over vast distances was producing cumulative effects. Soldiers displayed cycles of high performance, followed by debilitating crashes, sometimes lasting a full day. Hallucinations, tremors, and emotional volatility increased. Dependence became more apparent. Troops would request tablets before even routine marches, fearing the collapse that came without them. Some officers noted that units without sufficient supply underperformed drastically, undermining cohesion and pace. Yet the High Command continued to prioritize speed and momentum. The East demanded rapid advances to prevent the Soviet forces from regrouping. Pervitin became an operational necessity, not a supplement. The stimulant extended the army's endurance beyond human limits, enabling marches and maneuvers that would have otherwise been impossible. But the risk was mounting. Chemical dependence, physiological strain, and psychological instability were silently spreading through the ranks. The endless roads of the East tested the Reich in ways the French campaign never had. Men marched farther, fought longer, and remained, chemically sharpened through conditions that would have broken previous generations of soldiers. Pervitin allowed this extraordinary performance, but at the cost of human fragility, a fragility that could only be concealed until the demands of the campaign revealed it fully. By the winter of 1941, the Wehrmacht was deep into the Soviet Union. The initial successes of Operation Barbarossa, the rapid thrusts through Belarus and Ukraine, had relied heavily on speed, coordination, and, increasingly, Pervitin. Soldiers had learned to push past exhaustion. Tanks had traversed long distances without significant pauses, and pilots flew repeated sorties while barely sleeping. Yet the eastern winter introduced a challenge that no stimulant could fully overcome: the sheer, relentless oppression of cold, snow, and ice. Temperatures dropped below freezing, and soldiers marching through mud and frozen ground faced conditions far harsher than anything encountered in France. Infantry columns advanced across fields slick with ice, their boots sinking into snowdrifts, while wind cut through clothing layers and numbed faces. Panzer crews struggled as engines choked on frozen fuel. Transmissions stiffened, and tracks became entangled in ice-laden terrain. Even the Luftwaffe contended with frost on wings and instruments, icing of bombsight optics, and the mental strain of flying over a featureless, frozen landscape for hours at a time. Pervitin, once a near miraculous aid, now revealed its limitations. Medical officers noted that while the stimulant could temporarily suppress fatigue and maintain alertness, it could not prevent hypothermia, frostbite, or the slow depletion of energy reserves caused by exposure. Soldiers, marching in the open, were more active and responsive than they might have been naturally, but they shivered continuously, their extremities growing numb despite the temporary surge in cardiovascular activity. Infantry diaries recounted hands so cold that rifles could not be gripped properly. Yet, the mind remained artificially alert due to chemical stimulation. It was a surreal separation between mental clarity and bodily vulnerability. In armoured units, the stimulant allowed tank crews to remain focused during long drives over frozen terrain, but machinery did not respond as predictably. Engines stalled, tracks froze, and crews had to spend hours repairing vehicles while remaining chemically awake. Pervitin sustained concentration, yet the physical demands exceeded the body's ability to recover. Medical logs described soldiers trembling with exhaustion, sometimes falling asleep, unintentionally inside cramped compartments. Tremors and palpitations increased as dosage and reliance escalated. The Luftwaffe faced similar constraints. Pilots under stimulant influence could maintain alertness for hours, but the cold sapped strength, slowed reflexes, and made instrument management more hazardous. Reports noted an uptick in near-miss accidents, particularly when adrenaline and stimulant-induced confidence masked the subtle cues of frost-compromised equipment. Flight surgeons observed that while decision-making appeared faster, reaction to sudden mechanical failure was delayed by the body's impaired state. Psychological strain became pronounced. Soldiers wrote letters describing the dissonance between mental acuity and physical pain. "I feel awake, but my legs do not belong to me," one private wrote. The stimulant pushed men to march and fight further. The natural human endurance allowed, yet the body's breakdown loomed inevitable. Crashes became more frequent, hallucinations more vivid, and irritability heightened. Units dependent on the drug found that once the effects wore off, morale and cohesion suffered dramatically. Medical officers increasingly warned that continued reliance on Pervitin during such extreme conditions was dangerous. Soldiers could be artificially propelled forward, but the cold, hunger, and prolonged exertion were forces the stimulant could not erase. The human body, in the harsh eastern winter, had limits that chemical intervention could only temporarily mask. The Wehrmacht continued forward, pressing the offensive with unprecedented speed. Pervitin sustained the momentum, yet beneath the surface, the chemical advantage was faltering against nature's immutable force. Winter in the east was no longer a minor inconvenience. It was a revelation. Even a drug-fueled army had boundaries, and for those who relied on stimulants to outrun fatigue, the cold was unforgiving, a stark reminder that no tablet could conquer the elemental, relentless power of winter. As the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into Soviet territory during the winter of 1941, the logistical demands of a Pervitin-dependent army became starkly apparent. The initial advances of Operation Barbarossa had relied on speed and surprise, with supply lines stretched thin but sufficient for the short campaigns in Poland and France. In the east, however, distances expanded dramatically, terrain grew unpredictable, and the winter intensified every challenge. The chemical edge that Pervitin provided could not offset the growing logistical burden, it only amplified it. Every soldier, tank crew, and pilot dependent on the stimulant required a steady, uninterrupted supply. Field medics reported that units unable to access Pervitin performed noticeably worse, even in minor operations. Infantry that had been capable of 20 to 30 kilometers in a day under stimulant, influence suddenly slowed when shipments lagged. Panic, fatigue, and irritability surfaced almost immediately. Commanders noted that delays in stimulant delivery could compromise the timing of assaults, the cohesion of armored advances, and the readiness of artillery units. In essence, Pervitin had become as critical to operations as ammunition or fuel. Supply officers faced a nightmare of coordination. Crates of tablets had to move alongside rations, ammunition, and winter clothing, often through snowbound roads, muddy fields, or over railways destroyed by retreating Soviet forces. Trucks carrying stimulant supplies frequently froze in place, their contents becoming temporarily inaccessible. In some cases, depots ran out entirely, forcing medics to ration tablets within units. Reports described soldiers arguing over access, hoarding pills, and even attempting to supplement rations, with civilian caches salvaged from nearby towns. Dependence on the stimulant had created a fragile system, one that relied on constant, precise logistical support to maintain operational effectiveness. The strain extended to medical personnel. Field hospitals were inundated with soldiers, suffering crashes from prolonged use, often coinciding with supply delays. Tremors, severe exhaustion, hallucinations, and emotional instability became more common as dosage intervals lengthened beyond what the human body could tolerate. Medics struggled to keep units functional, sometimes isolating soldiers for recovery, while the remainder of the unit pressed forward. In tanks, drivers and gunners occasionally became incapacitated mid-maneuver, requiring on-the-spot intervention. Flight surgeons documented pilots who had taken multiple doses in quick succession, only to crash, mentally and physically, when the stimulant wore off. The dependence on Pervitin had created a new operational risk. A single misstep in supply could ripple across entire units. Commanders recognized the problem but faced hard choices. The pace of the offensive could not be reduced. Speed and momentum were vital to prevent Soviet forces from reorganizing. As a result, rationing became uneven. Some units were oversupplied, creating temporary bursts of efficiency but increasing the risk of severe crashes. Others operated under strict limitations, forcing soldiers to function with inadequate stimulant support and suffering immediate declines in performance. Even as victories continued, the strain on supply lines revealed the vulnerability of the chemical advantage. Pervitin could enhance endurance, sharpen focus, and suppress fatigue, but only when available in sufficient proportion, quantity, and at precisely timed intervals. In the vastness of the Eastern Front, such precision was difficult, if not impossible, to maintain consistently. By the end of the first winter campaign, it was clear the stimulant had transformed operations, but it had also become a liability. The army had moved farther and faster than ever. Yet every success carried the hidden risk of breakdowns, dependency, and logistical failure. Supply lines were no longer just conduits of food, fuel, and ammunition. They had become lifelines for a chemically driven force whose performance depended on a tablet as much as strategy. Pervitin had accelerated the army's advance, but it had also exposed a fragile backbone, one vulnerable to the harsh, sprawling reality of war in the East. As Operation Barbarossa progressed into its second winter, reports from frontline units revealed a disturbing pattern beyond physical exhaustion. The hidden toll Pervitin exacted on morale. Soldiers had been trained to endure hardships and to trust in the speed and efficiency of the German military machine. Pervitin had initially seemed to make that trust easier to maintain, suppressing fatigue, sharpening focus, and instilling a chemical confidence. Yet over weeks and months of continuous campaigning, the stimulant began to erode the very psychological foundation it had appeared to strengthen. Letters intercepted by medical officers and confidential diaries described soldiers' inner conflicts in stark terms. On one page, a private could recount an extraordinary march of 25 kilometers completed in near-continuous wakefulness, noting exhilaration and pride. On the next, the same soldier admitted a growing dread, anxiety, irritability, and a sense of detachment from the world around him. Pervitin had erased the immediate sensation of tiredness, but it had not erased the human need for rest, emotional stability, or psychological decompression. Soldiers were performing feats of endurance that bordered on superhuman and simultaneously losing touch with their natural coping mechanisms. Field medics observed that these effects were amplified by the isolation of the Eastern Front. Units operated across vast distances with limited communication, often in extreme cold and snow. Pervitin allowed men to march, drive, or fly beyond the normal limits of fatigue, but the chemical edge came with a mental cost. Soldiers who relied on the stimulant frequently became short-tempered, impatient with comrades, and less able to process stressful events calmly. Simple disputes escalated. Minor injuries were perceived as more critical. Emotional reserves, normally a buffer against despair, were depleted faster than the drug could replenish alertness. Tank crews and armored divisions were particularly affected. Inside the cramped, heated, and constantly vibrating interiors of panzers, men under prolonged stimulant use reported mounting frustration and irritability. Drivers snapped at gunners over minor mistakes, while commanders expressed impatience during extended operations. Officers noted that unit cohesion, normally reinforced by shared fatigue and mutual care, was fraying under chemical pressure. Yet the visible results of enhanced performance, rapid advances, coordinated attacks, and relentless momentum masked these underlying tensions from higher command. The Luftwaffe experienced a parallel effect. Pilots, operating under Pervitin during extended reconnaissance or bombing sorties, displayed fewer errors during missions but exhibited emotional volatility afterward. Flight surgeons noted an increase in irritability, insomnia, and brief depressive episodes once the stimulant wore off. Even minor setbacks, such as poor visibility or delayed targets, triggered disproportionate responses, ranging from nervous agitation to reckless maneuvers. Chemical-enhanced confidence created temporary invulnerability, but its withdrawal exposed soldiers to the psychological fragility the stimulant had concealed. The consequence was subtle but cumulative. Morale became increasingly dependent on the availability of Pervitin itself. Soldiers who did not receive adequate doses complained of fatigue, apathy, and anxiety. The stimulant became not only a tool for endurance but a psychological crutch, a chemical expectation intertwined with the soldier's sense of competence and well-being. The army was winning battles, advancing rapidly, yet the mental health of its men was quietly deteriorating. High command remained largely oblivious to this hidden cost. Operational efficiency overshadowed the poison's quiet erosion of morale. Medics' reports were classified, noted only in internal memos, and rarely acted upon. The outward appearance of success masked a growing psychological vulnerability, an invisible fracture that, if left unchecked, could undermine the very speed and precision Pervitin had helped achieve. The stimulant had sustained the Wehrmacht, but it had also reshaped the minds of its soldiers. The war was no longer fought solely against enemies in the field. It was being fought inside each man, silently, chemically, and relentlessly. By the winter of 1941, the effects of prolonged stimulant use were no longer confined to enlisted men. Officers, tasked with leading men through the relentless tempo of the Eastern Campaign, were beginning to experience their own silent struggle. While Pervitin had initially provided them with heightened alertness, sharper focus, and the ability to oversee extended operations without sleep, the cumulative impact of prolonged use was taking a subtle but dangerous toll, one largely hidden from higher command. Field reports from mid-level commanders revealed an unusual pattern. Officers who relied heavily on the stimulant were increasingly prone to lapses in judgment during extended operations. One battalion commander noted that after 3 consecutive days of extended marches and combat planning while under stimulant influence, he found himself issuing orders too quickly, sometimes contradicting prior instructions. The chemical clarity that had once allowed him to coordinate complex maneuvers now occasionally amplified impulsive decision-making. In a few cases, it led to overextension of units, leaving soldiers exposed to counterattack. Medical officers documented more than errors in judgment. Tremors, heart palpitations, and persistent agitation were now appearing in officers previously considered resilient to fatigue. A regimental medic reported observing a captain who, after leading his troops through continuous movement for over 48 hours, experienced a sudden bout of shaking so severe he could barely write orders. The officer insisted he was fine and tried to continue, but the physical evidence of chemical stress was unmistakable. Such incidents, while not yet widespread, signaled the emergence of a systemic problem. Even command structures were not immune to the physiological and psychological costs of stimulant dependence. The mental burden of command, combined with Pervitin's effects, created a dangerous feedback loop. Officers experienced artificial confidence and enhanced alertness, while the stimulant was active. But once it wore off, the mental fatigue became acute. Many reported difficulty concentrating, emotional irritability, and a heightened sense of stress when faced with operational setbacks. In some cases, officers were forced to isolate themselves briefly, struggling to regain composure before resuming command. Medics quietly advised rotation and rest, but operational demands often made these interventions impractical. The psychological effects were also evident in interpersonal relations. Officers under stimulant influence were sharper and more decisive, but also less tolerant of subordinate hesitation or dissent. Reports indicate that friction within staff units increased as stimulants magnified impatience and a sense of urgency. Subordinates sometimes found themselves navigating heightened aggression or abrupt judgment from commanders whose clarity was chemically enhanced but whose empathy and patience had diminished. Despite these emerging issues, the High Command remained focused on outcomes. The East demanded speed, endurance, and relentless operational pressure. Officers' dependence on Pervitin was largely ignored, rationalized by the necessity of maintaining momentum and achieving objectives before Soviet forces could regroup. Internal memos from medical divisions, warning of the long-term risk to judgment and mental health, were filed under restricted classification. Their insights rarely acted upon in time to prevent the subtle erosion of command stability. The silent struggle of officers highlighted a paradox. Pervitin extended their operational capacity but also undermined their natural faculties, introducing a hidden fragility at the heart of command. Germany's chemical edge had reached into the upper echelons of leadership, sustaining rapid advances while quietly shaping the mental state of those directing them. The war was no longer only about strategy, terrain, or enemy forces. It was being waged inside every officer, chemically sharpened, physically taxed, and psychologically stretched to the limits. And in the endless expanses of the East, that hidden struggle would grow alongside the army's outward successes. As the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into Soviet territory, a subtle but increasingly dangerous pattern emerged among units heavily reliant on Pervitin. Overconfidence that frequently led to operational overreach. The stimulant, while extending endurance, sharpening focus, and sustaining alertness, also artificially inflated soldiers' and officers' sense of capability. What had once been disciplined, coordinated advances began to exhibit signs of impulsive aggression, risk-taking, and tactical misjudgment, consequences largely invisible to the distant High Command. Infantry units were the first to exhibit these tendencies in noticeable ways. Soldiers under prolonged stimulant influence pressed forward with a confidence bordering on recklessness. In one notable engagement near Smolensk, a battalion advanced beyond its supporting units, convinced that its pace alone would overwhelm the enemy. The unit succeeded in seizing key positions, but only after the command chain adjusted rapidly to cover exposed flanks. Medics documented both the temporary euphoria that drove the advance and the physical and psychological toll. Afterward, soldiers collapsed into deep exhaustion, some shaking uncontrollably, while others became agitated and argumentative over minor orders. Panzer divisions experienced a parallel manifestation. Tank crews, energized by Pervitin, displayed remarkable initiative during extended thrusts across open terrain. Drivers maneuvered heavy vehicles with unprecedented coordination, and gunners reacted with razor-sharp precision. Yet overconfidence led to frequent overextension. One platoon, convinced of its invincibility, pursued a retreating Soviet unit too far ahead of infantry support, encountering a counterattack that could have been catastrophic. The mechanical precision of the crews masked the underlying vulnerability introduced by chemical stimulation. The Luftwaffe, particularly pilots on extended reconnaissance and bombing missions, also demonstrated overreach. Pilots accustomed to long hours under stimulant influence sometimes ignored conservative flight protocols. They dove lower than recommended, lingered over targets, and took risks that non-stimulated pilots would have avoided. Flight surgeons documented that these behaviors coincided with heightened confidence and diminished perception of personal danger. The stimulant had created an altered sense of capability that was difficult to regulate. Medical officers were acutely aware of the problem. Internal reports noted that the combination of physical stimulation, sleep suppression, and adrenaline produced a hyperactive self-assessment in soldiers and officers alike. Individuals believed they could perform tasks beyond normal human limits, often ignoring both tactical prudence and unit cohesion. While many missions succeeded due to this aggressive behavior, the same reports warned that overconfidence was inherently unstable. Minor setbacks could quickly spiral into mistakes when judgment was chemically skewed. Commanders at the operational level faced a dilemma. On the one hand, Pervitin-fueled advances enabled the rapid tempo critical to Blitzkrieg. On the other, the same stimulant created unpredictable human behavior, introducing risks that could compromise entire offensives. Orders and coordination could not always compensate for impulsive actions, especially when units were widely dispersed across the vast Eastern Front. The High Command largely ignored these warnings. Success in the field reinforced the belief that risk-taking was a tactical advantage, and the visible gains overshadowed subtle warning signs. Yet within medical logs, the term overreach began to appear with increasing frequency, signaling that the chemical-enhanced confidence of soldiers and officers was not without cost. Germany's armies were moving faster and striking harder than ever before, but the stimulant that powered their speed had also loosened the restraints that disciplined judgment once provided. In the endless expanses of the Soviet Union, overconfidence was no longer a theoretical concern. It was becoming a structural vulnerability, one that would carry consequences far beyond immediate engagements. By the end of the second winter in the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht faced a crisis that no strategic plan or chemical aid could fully resolve. Cumulative winter fatigue. Pervitin, which had once allowed soldiers to operate for days on minimal rest, could no longer mask the relentless toll of cold, distance, and continuous combat. The army had become dependent on the stimulant, yet even this advantage was insufficient against the grinding reality of the Eastern winter. Infantry units, spread across hundreds of kilometers, were the first to exhibit widespread symptoms. Soldiers had been marching for days through frozen rivers, mud-choked roads, and snow-laden forests, boots caked in ice, frost biting through clothing, muscles stiff and sore. Men relied on Pervitin to push forward. Early on, the stimulant masked exhaustion effectively, but by the third or fourth day of continuous movement, the effects waned, leaving soldiers physically depleted and psychologically brittle. Field medics documented tremors, palpitations, and cognitive lapses. Troops who had appeared alert and coordinated during marches suddenly stumbled, fell behind, or froze during inspections. The chemical edge had diminished in the face of sustained environmental stress. Panzer divisions confronted a parallel crisis. Tanks could cover extraordinary distances with crews chemically sharpened, but the harsh winter created mechanical and human vulnerabilities simultaneously. Engines froze, tracks jammed in ice, and the cramped interiors amplified the effects of stimulant fatigue. Drivers experienced microsleeps while gunners miscalculated trajectories, and commanders struggled to maintain cohesion as overstimulated crews alternated between bursts of hyperfocus and sudden physical collapse. Medical logs from armoured units indicated that several breakdowns were severe enough to temporarily immobilise whole crews, leaving tanks vulnerable at critical moments. The Luftwaffe faced a similar dilemma. Pilots on long-range reconnaissance and bombing missions had flown repeated sorties under stimulant influence, yet the cumulative effect of limited sleep, extreme cold at high altitude, and prolonged stimulant use led to fatigue that Pervitin could no longer mask. Flight surgeons reported cognitive errors, missed coordinates, misread instruments, and slow reaction times during emergency maneuvers. Some pilots exhibited severe irritability and emotional detachment, while others experienced brief but intense hallucinations, mistaking terrain features or reflections for enemy positions. The stimulant had enabled endurance beyond human norms, but the prolonged exposure to both chemical stimulation and environmental stress had reached a breaking point. Medical officers documented a common pattern. The longer the exposure to stimulant use, combined with environmental extremes, the faster the body's reserves were depleted. Crashes became prolonged, affecting entire units simultaneously. Soldiers who had previously operated in near-perfect cohesion now exhibited lapses in discipline, decision-making, and situational awareness. Officers, many of whom were also reliant on Pervitin, were similarly affected, sometimes issuing flawed orders while physically and mentally compromised. High Command remained largely unaware of the scale of the crisis, focused as they were on momentum and territorial gains. The army was advancing, but the physical and psychological cost was mounting in silence. Reports from medics were filed under restricted classification, and the full extent of the winter fatigue crisis was rarely acknowledged outside of isolated command circles. The eastern winter had exposed the limits of chemical enhancement. Pervitin had temporarily extended human endurance, but in the face of relentless cold, continuous movement, and cumulative fatigue, its effects faltered. The soldiers' bodies, stretched past natural limits, were beginning to assert themselves in ways that could not be ignored. The Wehrmacht's advance continued, driven by orders and the stimulant's residual effects. But the winter fatigue crisis was a warning. No pill could indefinitely overcome the harsh, unyielding reality of war in the East. The army had been chemically sustained, yet nature and human limits were beginning to reclaim their authority. By the midpoint of Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht had reached depths in the East that no army had ever attempted. Endless roads, frozen rivers, dense forests, and scattered villages stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Amid this relentless expansion, a new threat began to surface, one not imposed by enemy fire, artillery, or weather, but by the very stimulant that had fueled the army's earlier successes, Pervitin. The chemical dependence that had begun as a tactical advantage was now evolving into a shadow of addiction, quietly undermining morale, cohesion, and operational effectiveness. Medical officers were the first to recognize the pattern. Soldiers who had relied on the stimulant during initial thrusts now requested tablets not only for combat operations but for every waking moment. The chemical had become a psychological crutch. Letters from the front describe the fear of missing a dose. "Without it, I cannot focus," one private wrote. "My legs refuse to move as they should, and my mind feels fogged." Another noted, "The march is endless, but I feel nothing without the tablets. I am afraid to stop." Dependence was no longer just physical, it had become a pervasive mental need. The signs were subtle at first. Soldiers displayed heightened irritability when doses were delayed or insufficient. Minor disagreements escalated quickly into arguments or outright aggression. Concentration waned despite chemical stimulation if intake had been irregular. Some men exhibited a compulsive urge to consume additional tablets, even exceeding recommended quantities, often without direct orders. In several field hospitals, medics documented cases of overstimulation followed by severe crashes, trembling, palpitations, confusion, and emotional instability. Officers were not immune. Captains, lieutenants, and even battalion commanders began relying on Pervitin to maintain operational oversight. Diaries recovered from the campaign reveal officers acknowledging that decisions once guided by experience and judgment now felt chemically sharpened. Yet with each subsequent day, some admitted to experiencing agitation, impatience, and paranoia when the stimulant wore off. One regimental commander wrote, "I feel awake, but my mind is not mine. Without the tablet, I fear I cannot lead." The dependence among leadership created a new form of risk: impaired judgment at the very point where it was most crucial. Tank crews in particular faced compounded effects. Confined to metal interiors for long periods, exposed to vibration, cold, and stress, soldiers relied on Pervitin to maintain focus during extended maneuvers. Medics observed that prolonged stimulant use amplified not only physical endurance but emotional volatility. Gunners became restless, drivers impatient, and commanders more aggressive in decision-making. Small errors became magnified in the tight confines of the tank, threatening both safety and operational efficiency. The Luftwaffe, operating over the vast expanses of the Eastern Front, experienced similar patterns. Pilots who flew long missions reported both enhanced focus and a growing compulsion for repeated dosing. Some admitted to feeling unable to operate safely without the stimulant. Flight surgeons documented irritability, reduced judgment, and even brief episodes of hallucination after prolonged use. Dependence was widespread, and the psychological need for Pervitin became as operationally significant as ammunition or fuel. High Command remained largely unaware of the scale of the issue. Operational success and rapid territorial gains masked the human cost. Medics' reports were logged, but rarely acted upon. Units continued to rely on the stimulant, pushing both soldiers and officers into a cycle of dependence from which withdrawal was inevitable. Pervitin had extended endurance, sharpened focus, and sustained momentum, but it had also cast a shadow, a chemical grip that subtly reshaped behavior, heightened risk-taking, and created a hidden reliance. The army was advancing, but the shadow of addiction was growing in its midst, a silent companion to every step across the endless roads of the East. By late 1941, as the Wehrmacht advanced deeper into Soviet territory, a disturbing pattern emerged that threatened the very effectiveness of Germany's chemically enhanced army: the collapse of coordination. Pervitin, once celebrated as a force multiplier, had pushed human endurance beyond natural limits, enabling extraordinary speed and aggression. Yet the very stimulant that kept soldiers awake, alert, and confident also undermined the subtle mechanics of teamwork, timing, and command, the foundation of any organized military operation. Field reports highlighted multiple instances where units, operating under stimulant influence, advanced ahead of supporting elements. Infantry battalions, driven by artificial alertness and chemical confidence, occasionally pressed beyond artillery support, leaving themselves exposed to ambushes. Tanks maneuvered with precision yet occasionally outpaced their own infantry, creating gaps between armoured spearheads and foot soldiers. The very success of Blitzkrieg, its relentless forward motion, began to exacerbate structural vulnerabilities. Speed became both an advantage and a liability. Medical officers and unit medics noted that coordination failures often coincided with stimulant-induced overconfidence. Soldiers believed themselves capable of sustained action far beyond natural limits, yet their judgment was subtly impaired. Orders that should have been followed with careful attention were executed with mechanical precision, sometimes in isolation from the broader strategy. Minor deviations multiplied into operational risks. One Panzer Division report documented a column advancing several kilometers ahead of reconnaissance units, leaving itself exposed to counterattack. The mission succeeded, but the officers acknowledged that the margin of error was now dangerously thin. Communication networks also suffered. Radio operators, overextended and chemically stimulated, miscommunicated coordinates, repeated orders incorrectly, or failed to relay crucial updates. In some cases, officers, sustained on Pervitin for days, issued directives without fully integrating situational reports from subordinate units. Flight reports indicated that Luftwaffe pilots occasionally acted independently, interpreting orders with excessive latitude due to overstimulation. Coordination, the invisible glue holding complex operations together, was fraying. The psychological effects of prolonged stimulant use intensified the problem. Soldiers and officers alike displayed heightened irritability, impatience, and emotional volatility during extended operations. Minor disagreements escalated, and decisions were sometimes made impulsively rather than collaboratively. Commanders found it increasingly difficult to enforce discipline among troops who believed chemical-enhanced focus made them infallible. The stimulant's euphoria and heightened confidence masked the slow decay of collective operational coherence. Even medics, responsible for both physical and psychological oversight, struggled to intervene effectively. They documented crashes, breakdowns, and errors, but operational imperatives rarely allowed units to pause for recovery. Soldiers were pushed onward to maintain the tempo of Blitzkrieg, and Pervitin's temporary benefits outweighed any concern for the gradual erosion of coordination. The High Command, focused on territorial gains and strategic momentum, remained largely unaware of the growing fragility at the unit level. By winter's approach, the signs were unmistakable. The army could move faster, strike harder, and maintain alertness longer than any opponent anticipated. Yet the very chemical advantage sustaining these feats also carried the seeds of operational instability. Coordination, once reinforced by training, discipline, and natural human pacing, was now contingent on chemical intervention. Without careful management, even minor lapses could cascade into significant tactical vulnerabilities. Pervitin had enabled extraordinary performance, but it had also introduced fragility into the Wehrmacht's command structure, threatening to unravel the precise orchestration upon which Blitzkrieg depended. The army was moving relentlessly, yet the invisible cracks were widening. Success had a cost, and the chemical engine driving victory now carried within it the seeds of systemic collapse. By the close of 1941, after months of chemical-enhanced warfare across Europe and deep into the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht faced a reckoning few outside the medical corps fully understood. Pervitin had allowed the German army to move faster, strike harder, and sustain operations longer than any previous generation of soldiers could have imagined. It had sharpened reflexes, suppressed fatigue, and bolstered confidence to the point of overreach. Yet the very stimulant that enabled Blitzkrieg had also left a trail of human fragility, dependence, and psychological strain that was now impossible to ignore. Reports from field medics, often filed quietly and classified as restricted, painted a grim picture. Soldiers who had relied on Pervitin for weeks or months exhibited cumulative effects: tremors, palpitations, severe fatigue, hallucinations, and episodes of emotional volatility. Cases of impulsive aggression, overconfidence, and reckless maneuvering became more frequent as units pushed the limits of chemical endurance. Letters from the front, diaries, and personal reports revealed a widespread awareness among the men themselves that their bodies were no longer fully their own. The stimulant dictated their energy, their focus, and sometimes even their perception of reality. The human cost was visible in multiple theatres. Infantry units struggled to maintain cohesion after extended operations. Panzer crews collapsed inside tanks once the Speeted stimulant wore off. Pilots returned from extended sorties jittery, disoriented, or emotionally unstable. Officers, previously regarded as the stabilizing force, were equally affected. Their judgment, sharpened chemically, occasionally tipped into rashness, leading units into situations that required last-minute corrections or incurred unnecessary risk. Coordination, the backbone of Blitzkrieg, was increasingly tenuous, and its reliability was now as dependent on the flow of stimulants as on training or strategy. Medical officers recorded a chilling pattern. Dependence had become systemic. Soldiers requested Pervitin not only to sustain combat operations, but to maintain any semblance of normalcy in the field. The stimulant had become a psychological lifeline. Supply shortages created immediate drops in operational efficiency. Units without adequate doses experienced decreased alertness, heightened irritability, and decreased cohesion. The very chemical that had once given Germany a decisive advantage now introduced a structural vulnerability. The army's tempo was tied to the consistent availability of a drug. High command, while largely unaware of the scope of these issues, began to notice subtle cracks. Reports of coordination failures, impulsive actions, and intermittent collapses reached operational officers, but were largely interpreted as temporary challenges of extreme conditions rather than consequences of chemical reliance. The urgency of the Eastern Campaign and the imperative of speed overshadowed the warnings contained in medical logs. Soldiers were chemically enabled to advance further than their bodies could naturally endure, yet the underlying fragility remained unaddressed. The reckoning, however, was inevitable. Pervitin had temporarily erased human limits, but those limits still existed. The longer the army relied on stimulants, the more pronounced the physical, psychological, and operational consequences became. Fatigue, dependence, and overconfidence were accumulating in parallel with victories. The chemical edge that had fueled Germany's early triumphs now carried within it the seeds of systemic vulnerability, a vulnerability that would become brutally apparent in the extended campaigns that lay ahead. Pervitin had been a weapon as potent as any rifle or tank. It had propelled the Wehrmacht, feats previously thought impossible, but it had also altered the very men who wielded it, leaving an invisible trail of human cost that could not be ignored. The victories of 1941 were undeniable. Yet beneath the surface of rapid advances, mechanized precision, and battlefield success, the army faced a quiet, inevitable reckoning. A war within, fought inside every soldier, every officer, and every mechanized unit. A war the drug could accelerate but never win.